Chapter 1673. A baby's flesh was brittle and could not be boiled for too long. Baby girls were the best. Children's flesh was tender and cooked to a certain extent. Ginger garlic rice wine removed the fishy smell. Boys were the best. Adults' flesh was sour but chewy. Men's lean flesh was especially outstanding. Women had more white flesh and were slightly greasy. They were suitable for human oil. The flesh of old men was unbearably stinky and sour. It was tasteless. Only human bones were boiled into soup with spices. The soup was rich and fragrant. Apart from these, the author had also tried unborn fetuses in women's wombs. There were fetuses every month. The entire Cannibal Rhapsody had less than 500 words, but each word was filled with the greatest malice and evil in the world. After reading the Cannibal Rhapsody, Lu Zheng's desire for peace grew stronger. He had staked everything on Enshui, hoping that such a tragedy would not happen again. In the end, Enshui disappointed him again and again. Enshui and Enduishi could not bear Lu Zheng's ambition. Kang Xintong sobbed. Human breasts. How could they make them? Lu Zheng said calmly, that depends on the situation. Kang Xintong was shocked by the information revealed in Lu Zheng's words. Her red eyes widened. She called out hesitantly, her voice trembling, "Foster father, if Enshui was a wise ruler, there would naturally be people who would stand up and take the blame for the matter of mixing human breast milk as army rations." Lu Zheng sighed. We are not the other tribes. They are unscrupulous and cannibalism is a common occurrence. But we are different. There are some things the other tribes can do and we can't. Using humans as food to fill one's stomach, even if it's an expedient measure, is an act that goes against human ethics. It's extremely cruel. Not only will it be criticized by the world, but it will also be reviled by future generations. Even so, it depends on whether it's worth it. Kang Xintong's voice was as soft as a mosquito's. Foster father, you mean, Lu Zheng said, if we're really at the end of the line, Enshui is worthy of being reviled for generations. Human breasts are also worth it. He didn't care about using human breasts as army rations, but that Enshui wasn't worthy of others taking the blame for him. This was Lu Zheng's worldview. It wasn't just him, many strategists were the same. After Kang Xintong heard this, her body slightly trembled. It was unknown what kind of battle was going on in her heart. If you think it's cruel, wait until these matters are settled and you can stay in the inner courtyard until you are of age. I will find a good marriage for you. Lu Zheng's expression was calm as he said, Hua Yuan said that the provisions will arrive in 3 days, but this person's words cannot be trusted. He is not loyal to Enshui and even has the ambition to murder and replace him. 3 days later, the rations would still be nowhere to be seen. Lu Shi has secured his victory in advance. Even though Lu Zheng thought it absurd, he had to admit that his classmate was more suitable than Enshui to be the ruler of the world. It was time for this dispute to come to an end. Kang Xintong said, will foster father turn to Duke Lanting in the future? That's right, she cares a lot about him. Value? It was hard to say. Lu Shi's personality was hard to predict. It would not be an exaggeration to say that she was moody and temperamental. She had tried to recruit him time and time again, but each time, she had tried to sow discord and scheme. Who knew what her true intentions were? Was she really trying to recruit him or was she just putting on a show? Lu Zheng was a sensible person, but he also thought too much. It was easy for him to get into a dead end. He continued, however, I'm not senior brother Cheng Yumo. If Enshui really loses, he'll lay low for a while. He'll most likely make use of his relationship with Langyi Academy to become an official again. Cheng Yumo? The senior brother that foster father mentioned before? Lu Zheng said, he is a gentleman. His temperament is different from mine and he is more thorough in his thinking. He is good in every way except for one thing. He is too selfless. Ever since Huang Song was defeated, there was no news of Yumo and he stayed at home. Of course, he did not choose Huang Song. He considered many things, mainly for his senior brothers and Master Yuanjing. He did not want to implicate them. Kong Shintong did not understand. How can it be implicated? Lu Zheng said, if you carefully observe the officials under Lu Shi's tent, you will find out how powerful Langyi Academy is. Duke Lanting may not care about this. It doesn't matter if there is one more or one less. Kong Shintong thought that her idol would not be so narrow-minded. She doesn't care, but Yumo won't. The other people from Langyi Academy won't either, Lu Zheng said helplessly. There are few gentlemen in the world, but there are many petty people. Langyi Academy is not a pure land. Master Yuanjing cannot guarantee that the students he teaches will be decent gentlemen. There will always be people who rely on their relationship with Langyi Academy and do whatever it takes to climb up. This is not what the teacher and senior brothers want to see. But they can only restrain themselves and not others. The more Kong Shintong listened, the more she felt that something was wrong. If Lu Zheng thought that Cheng Jing, who avoided arousing suspicion, was a gentleman, did he not consider himself a villain? Cheng Jing chose to avoid arousing suspicion, but Lu Zheng said he wanted to become an official, foster father. Lu Zheng said, everyone's choice is different. There is nothing to criticize as long as you have a clear conscience. Kong Shintong also said, if so, I am also willing to follow you. I will never be a bird in the inner chamber. Lu Zheng's lips curled up into a faint smile. Good. Because of the human breast, Kong Shintong and Lu Zheng did not have the appetite to eat that day. They could not stop the soldiers from eating this batch of provisions. They could only guarantee that they would not eat it. Tomorrow, I will find an excuse to take you out of the military camp, and Chui was destined to kneel either in the hands of Jiang Pengji or Hua Yuan. Lu Zheng did not want to be buried with him. Besides, the provisions of the military camp could not last for 2 or 3 days. After the ammunition and provisions were exhausted, and Chui might not be able to control the situation. Lu Zheng cherished his life. He did not want to die before he saw the world at peace. Kong Shintong nodded. She raised her hand and soaked the hard flatbread in the hot soup. Otherwise, she could not bite it at all. Lu Zheng ate 2 bites and put it down. He let Kong Shintong eat the rest. Just as Lu Zheng had expected, the provisions promised by Hua Yuan did not arrive. Everyone raised their heads in anticipation, but they did not see the grain team. The people sent to receive the grain team fell into the enemy's ambush. The enemy gave them a head-on blow. They were beaten until they did not know which way was north. When En Shui received the news, he was so angry that he fainted. The main culprit, Li Yun, led the soldiers in his tent back to the camp happily. He thought that this was an ordinary meritorious service. He did not expect that his lord would give him a great merit. The enemy's scale was not large, and their combat power was not strong. Li Yun was practically suppressing them without any pressure. He did not expect that he would make a great contribution. Chapter 1674. Faced with Li Yun's question, Jiang Pengji remained silent for a second. Neither. No? Li Yun was even more puzzled. He could be considered an old official who had followed Jiang Pengji to conquer the world. He knew very well the gentleness and patience hidden under the cold, calculating surface of his lord. Li Yun casually asked, I don't deserve a reward if I haven't done anything. Naturally, it is my honor for my lord to reward me. However, I do not deserve this military merit of unknown origin. My lord, why don't you explain it to me so that I know where the credit comes from? Jiang Pengji couldn't help but roll her eyes at Li Yun. She joked, you can't figure it out? If you can't figure it out, I'll take back the credit. Don't, master." Seeing the cooked duck fly away, Li Yun's expression immediately dropped. He had an extremely disappointed look on his face. Jiang Pengji didn't have to look to know that the bullet screen in the streaming room would be full of "Little Angel Han Mei touch me, little Angel Han Mei don't cry, ow ow ow, how can a little angel be so cute, streamer, I advise you to be kind, don't bully my little angel." One had to admit that Li Yun did have the capital to rely on his beauty and cuteness. He had perfectly inherited the good features of his parents and had always been one of the plastic surgery templates for male stars in the entertainment circle in Salted Fish's world. Even though he was approaching his 30s, his face hadn't changed much from when he first saw him. The older people get, the less attractive they look. But the older Li Yun got, the more attractive he looked. When he smiled brightly, he looked like a sunny and healthy Prince Charming. He was good at both literature and martial arts, handsome and cute. Once he put on a straight face, there was no need for him to pretend to be aloof. His temperament also made him look dignified without being angry. He was a cold and aloof Prince Charming. The key was that he looked slender, but the muscles under his clothes made people want to vomit blood. Such a contrast made the group of salted fishes love her even more. Of course, salted fishes were a group of mystical existences. Some claimed to be Li Yun's mother fans, some claimed to be his career fans, some claimed to be his girlfriend fans. What was even more mystical were the poison junkies. Jiang Pengji had seen a couple article on the bullet screen about the cute and sunny Han Mei and the cold and aloof General Li Yun. The slogan of this group of fans was that they couldn't get Li Yun. If others couldn't get Li Yun, then let Li Yun suffer the consequences of his own actions. Jiang Pengji was speechless. There was simply nothing to say. Under the strong request of her fans, Jiang Pengji was magnanimous and did not continue to make things difficult for Li Yun. "I'm just kidding. Do I look like someone who goes back on his word?" Jiang Pengji had always treated the generals who came from the military very well. Even if the military expenses were overspent every year and she had to use her private treasury to make up for it, she never mentioned cutting the military supplies. She was even more generous with the generals who could be of use. She never lacked rewards during the New Year and other festivals. This habit had been going on for so many years, how could it be possible to cheat and blackmail Li Yun's military merits? She said sternly, "Does Han Mei know who the troops you led attacked?" Li Yun saw that Jiang Pengji had become serious and could not help but retract his smile. He said in all seriousness, "I don't know about that." Jiang Pengji was dumbfounded. "If An Shui heard what you said, he would most likely vomit blood in anger." "Why?" Li Yun asked when he did not understand. Jiang Pengji said, "You ambushed them by chance. You didn't plan it beforehand, but An Shui and the others didn't know about it. It was precisely because it was unintentional that it was even more infuriating." Li Yun's luck had always been good. This time, he had relied on his strength and luck to deal a heavy blow to the shaky morale of the enemy troops. Unfortunately, it was not Li Yun's intention. It was just a coincidence. If An Shui knew about this, wouldn't he be so angry that he would jump up in rage? If it was more serious, he might be so angry that he would have a cerebral hemorrhage. Li Yun could not understand Jiang Pengji's bad taste. He straightforwardly stabbed An Shui in the back. Even without this incident, An Shui wouldn't have been able to jump around for long. How can his failure be attributed to bad luck? To put it bluntly, An Shui's strength was insufficient. Why was he talking about luck as a fig leaf? Jiang Pengji held back her laughter and said, Han Mei's words are quite reasonable. An Shui was in urgent need of military rations, but Hua Yuan, who was at the rear, intentionally delayed. Coupled with Jiang Pengji's precise attacks, An Shui had lost more than he won in the past 6 months. He was swallowed up by Jiang Pengji every few days. In the past 6 months, An Shui had lost a considerable amount of territory. The front line suffered successive defeats, and the supply of military rations was intermittent. In the end, they could only mix human flesh with military rations to delay time. They never expected that the large amount of rations they had high hopes for would not arrive on time. The troops sent to receive the rations were even intercepted and killed by Li Yun and his men. One could imagine the heavy blow to their morale. If not for the fact that they were in different camps, the salted fish in the live stream would sympathize with An Shui. Zwa de Mani Manicure, Sai, which elder named Boss An Shui? He really spent his entire life trying to explain how unlucky the word Shui was. Even though he later chose the word Duo Shi, he still could not change his fate in this lifetime. Although I'm a hardcore fan of the streamer's camp, seeing how unlucky his opponent was, I could not help but want to climb over the wall to sympathize with him for 3 seconds. The salted fish had long been displeased with An Shui's name. Which elder would give their child the name Shui? Shui meant worry. He was destined to be unlucky for the rest of his life. Meng Meng de Xiao Bai Tu, An Shui, with the word Duo Shi. This naming style was quite common in ancient times. For example, Lu Gua, with the word Gaoji. The meaning of a name is the opposite of the word. It is both a warning and a restriction, but also a blessing. Of course, looking at it now, An Shui's name was indeed not well chosen. Fu Chi Duo Duo, the level of education of the father's generation can be seen from their names. Lu Shi, with the word Lanting, Li Yun, with the word Hanmei, Feng Jin, with the word Huayu. Which one of them was not pleasing to the ear, beautiful in writing, and perfect in meaning? However, An Shui was a maverick and was destined to fail. The salted fish complained to their heart's content. Anyway, only they and Jiang Pengji could see the bullet screen. An Shui could not see it, so what was there to be afraid of? Indeed, An Shui could not see it. So, was this the only consolation they had? Why? Why haven't the rations been delivered yet? Even if An Shui trusted Hua Yuan so much, when Hua Yuan did not perform well and endangered his life and ambitions, all his trust in him collapsed. Although there was an enemy ambush along the way, how could such a small ambush intercept the rations team? When An Shui was dissatisfied with Hua Yuan, he disliked him in every way. He wished he could drag him in front of him and roar at him. Unfortunately, Hua Yuan was at the rear. It was extremely inconvenient to communicate between the two places, let alone pursue Hua Yuan's responsibility immediately. An Shui's anger rose. The civil and military officials in his tent were also at their wits' end. It was not that they were incompetent, but even the cleverest housewife could not cook a meal without rice. How could they fight a war without rations? Of course, in the early stages, when there was sufficient rations, they did not gain any advantage from Fu Wang and the others. Now that there was a shortage of rations, they had even more reasons to find excuses for their defeat. At that moment, an official who was on good terms with Lu Zheng stepped forward and said, "Has my lord ever suspected Hua Yuan?" Chapter 1675. Your Highness, why don't you think about it? When Advisor Lu was in charge of the army provisions, he never made such a huge mistake. Ever since Lu Zheng had been frozen, all sorts of problems had popped up. An Shui didn't want to hear this. If he acknowledged Lu Zheng's ability and denied Hua Yuan, wouldn't that be slapping him in the face and admitting that he didn't know people well? In An Shui's opinion, Hua Yuan's ability was not inferior to Lu Zheng's. However, they specialized in different fields and couldn't be compared. The official didn't have mind-reading skills and naturally didn't know what An Shui was thinking. Advisor Lu has been assisting you since you were insignificant, Your Highness. He's been diligent and conscientious all these years, never slacking off for a single day. Your Highness, why don't you think about all the battles you've fought all these years? When did there ever be a problem with provisions? He continued, not noticing that An Shui's expression had darkened. On the other hand, Hua Yuan made such a huge mistake this time. Advisor Lu also said that Hua Yuan had disloyalty and was especially wary of him, and Chui said, "The most important thing now is how to get through this, not shirk responsibility." "What's the point of saying all this?" The official choked on Chui's words. It was Chui who had reprimanded Hua Yuan first. He hadn't started this topic, but now it was his fault. He wanted to defend himself, but someone tugged on his sleeve, indicating that he should return to his seat and stop arguing with Chui. Regardless of whether Hua Yuan had a problem or not, it was unwise to raise doubts now. Not only would it draw hatred to Lu Zheng, but it would also indirectly question Chui's ability to judge people. Your subject misspoke, the situation was not in his favor. After bowing, the official silently returned to his seat. Everyone continued to be gloomy. They weren't immortals and couldn't make food appear out of thin air. They'd already scavenged most of the provisions nearby. They could only hope that Hua Yuan would quickly replenish the supplies. Who knew that Hua Yuan would stand them up? Not only did he stand them up, he didn't even give them an explanation. More than one person muttered in his heart at this scene. Was there really nothing wrong with Hua Yuan? Was this guy really not a spy sent by the enemy? Or perhaps Hua Yuan really didn't want to rebel? The atmosphere in the tent froze for a long time. No one could think of a solution. At this moment, a report came from outside the tent. Chui's face was dark as he asked. Chui asked with a sinister look in his eyes, "What is it?" The soldier handed over a bamboo tube with both hands and said, "Before military advisor Lu left, he told me to give this to the Lord." Before leaving? Did Lu Zheng leave the barracks? When did this happen? Why didn't they hear anything? Some of them looked confused, but Chui knew, because he was the one who allowed Lu Zheng to leave the camp. Lu Zheng's condition worsened. If he continued to stay in the barracks, he wouldn't receive good care. It was very likely that he would die of illness in the barracks. Chui didn't want to be known as a heartless person, so he agreed to Lv Zheng's request and sent him to a village dozens of miles away to recuperate. This wasn't a big deal. Of course Chui wouldn't publicize it. What is it? Chui had someone present the item. He opened the lid of the bamboo tube and took out a neatly folded piece of paper. He casually swept a glance and immediately got up from the mat in shock. It was impossible to count on Hua Yuan to deliver food, but Chui could set his sights on the enemy granaries. It was not that no one had mentioned this suggestion before, but the feasibility of implementing it was too low because they did not know the location of Jiangpengji's granary. It was also impossible to count on a sneak attack on the granary to make Jiangpengji unable to recover. Everyone in the world knew that Jiangpengji was a crafty person with 3 burrows. She would never leave her military supplies in one place and wait for the enemy to plunder them all at once. However, if they knew the location of the enemy's provisions, even if there was only one location, they could temporarily solve the food crisis if the raid was successful. Chui didn't expect the sickly Lu Zheng to leave him such a huge surprise before he left. However, after his ecstasy came hesitation and doubt. Lu Zheng had been staying in his tent and hadn't left. Even if he was a divine strategist, it was impossible for him to know the location of the enemy's granary, right? If this information was true, why did he only bring it out now? Chui was hesitant, but the officials in his tent were very curious about what was written in the letter that made Chui react so strongly. Could it be a brilliant plan to break out of the situation? Everyone's hearts were pounding, but Chui didn't open his mouth to explain, so they didn't want to disturb him. Chui took a deep breath and made up his mind to make the letter public so that everyone could read it. My lord, this is a good opportunity. If the sneak attack was successful, they would be able to obtain a large amount of provisions, enough for the army to slowly retreat and plan their next move. This is good news, but why does the chief public security officer look unhappy? A few people with sharp eyes and bright minds guessed correctly. It was most likely that Shui's paranoia had flared up again and he was judging Lu Zheng with biased eyes. When they thought about it, they really pitied Lu Zheng. Hua Yuan had courted death with all his might, but Shui could speak up for him, while Lu Zheng was repeatedly doubted. Everyone thought so, but Shui didn't say anything, so they couldn't do anything. Because there was really no other way, Shui still took Lu Zheng's suggestion and attacked the granary at night. Little did they know, this was someone's scheme within a scheme. The burlap sack covering Lu Zheng's head was removed. The not-so-dazzling light made Lu Zheng's face look even gloomier. Before he could adjust to the light around him, he heard a call that he hadn't heard for many years. "Xiaoyin, how have you been?" Jiang Pengji's smug smile that hadn't changed much was magnified in front of his eyes. Lu Zheng's hands were tied behind his back, and he was half sitting on the ground. His hair was messy and he looked pathetic. "Where's my daughter?" Even though they hadn't seen each other for many years, Lu Zheng recognized her as soon as he saw her smiling face. "So that girl is your daughter? She's a girl, after all. How can she be treated like you?" Jiang Pengji squatted down and leveled her gaze with Lu Zheng. She smiled and said, "She's been tied up and placed somewhere else. I'm not a heartless person like Shui. I won't be cruel to the family of my enemy. Speaking of which, your daughter is really pretty. She doesn't look like your child at all." Lu Zheng took a deep breath and tasted the pain in his stomach that he hadn't felt in a long time. He pretended to be calm and said, "Because she's my adopted daughter. I quite like that little girl. She treats you extremely well. She's still biting people even when she's tied up. She doesn't let anyone touch a single hair on your body." After hearing this, Lu Zheng's terrible mood eased a little. In this cold and heartless world, only his adopted daughter could give him some comfort. Jiang Pengji said, "More than half a year ago, I asked Buku to pass a message to you, but you didn't reply to me directly. Are you trying to go back on your word? A message from Fangji?" Thinking of this, Lu Zheng's expression darkened. This guy had really slept with Zixiao. He's just a prisoner. You can do whatever you want with him. Jiang Pengji sighed. Everything was fine in the past. "Xiaoyin, you're treating me like an outsider. You know very well that based on our relationship, I can touch anyone but you. If you're not willing to submit to me, I'll set you free and let Master Yuanjing keep an eye on you." Lu Zheng gave her a sidelong glance. Only a ghost would believe her nonsense. "Where's Zixiao?" "I touched him." Jiang Pengji rested her chin on her hand and said, "Your touching is different." Lu Zheng couldn't take it anymore. "Lu Lanting, don't talk dirty at a time like this." Chapter 1676. I haven't seen you in years. I missed you so much that I couldn't help but tease you. Jiang Pengji raised her eyebrows and chuckled. She untied the rope that bound Lv and tossed it aside. Lv shivered and his eyebrows twitched. His expression seemed to be on the verge of breaking down and enduring. He leaned back slightly to avoid her approach. Now that his hands were free, he couldn't help but rub his sore wrists as he said in a slightly uncomfortable tone. "Lu Lanting, do you still think of yourself as a 12 or 13-year-old? This was the military camp, not a brothel where she drank and listened to music. She could not be so unrestrained. If I walk among the crowd, it's an exaggeration to say that I'm 12 or 13-year-old, but I can still say that I'm 15 or 16. Jiang Pengji teased him with a smile. "If I remember correctly, you're about the same age as Zixiao, but you look much more haggard than he does. People will believe you if you add 10 years to your age. Enqi is a troublesome person. You've helped him clean up his mess all these years, haven't you? You wake up earlier than the chickens, sleep later than the dogs, and do more than the oxen. You really live up to the saying, sleepless all day and night, wasted in the morning. LV Zheng looked up at Jiang Pengji. In a trance, he had the illusion that time and space were in disarray. The person standing in front of him was still the noble youth in brocade clothes. It was as if the person in front of him had stayed in the past. More than 10 years had not left a mark on her. Humph, your mouth is still as unforgiving as ever. You always like to pester others endlessly. When she was 12 or 13, she was pestering others endlessly. That was called naive, cute, and innocent. More than 10 years had passed, but she was still pestering others endlessly. He was not Wei Zixiao. Why would he indulge her? I'm arguing with reason. I'm presenting facts and reasoning. Since when was I pestering others endlessly? Jiang Pengji extended her hand and said, my tent is indeed clean, but the mud is dirty. How long do you plan to sit on the ground? Aren't you afraid of the cold? LV Zheng looked at her hand and tried hard to suppress the urge to slap it away. You're a scholar. I've taught you for 3 years. I didn't teach you to talk about Anqi every day. Jiang Pengji could not help but laugh. I thought you would say something like, you're a girl after all, don't be so vulgar. Even now, there were still people who liked to make an issue out of her gender. Even if it wasn't intentional, they would still subconsciously pull out her gender. Jiang Pengji didn't mind, because they were all outsiders, and outsiders that she looked down on. If Lu Zheng was like this, she would be very disappointed. LV Zheng raised his eyes to look at Jiang Pengji's face. She was wearing a short, round-collared robe that was made of stone. She still looked capable and neat as usual. Coupled with her handsome face, affectionate eyes, and half-smile. At first glance, she looked more like a young man from an aristocratic family with a romantic temperament. There were no feminine labels that people were familiar with on her, such as delicate and lovely, dignified and generous, but it was undeniable that she was indeed a woman, and she embodied another kind of rare beauty of women. Don't you know what you look like? Lu Zheng admired her in his heart, but his words were unforgiving. He grabbed Jiang Pengji's hand and stood up with her strength. Because LV Zheng was still sick, he felt dizzy when he suddenly stood up, and he almost fell forward. Jiang Pengji helped him up. LV Zheng tilted his head to look at her profile, and he muttered to himself. He hadn't recognized her gender back then, not because he and the people around him had made a mistake, but because she looked too good. Didn't Shui not give you meat to eat for the past 6 months? When they shook hands, she realized that LV Zheng was slimmer than she had expected. His palms were almost devoid of flesh. Zi Xiao was also thin, but some flesh could be squeezed out. LV Zheng, on the other hand, was a bag of bones. More than half a year ago, Jiang Pengji sent Fang Zhi to persuade LV Zheng. Fang Zhi returned in low spirits, but he also brought Jiang Pengji a lot of news. According to Fang Zhi's description, LV Zheng had been frozen by An Shui, but his situation wasn't very bad. He ate, drank, slept well, and even put on some weight. Looking at him now, he wasn't fat at all. If there was a typhoon outside, she could tie a rope around LV Zheng's neck and let him fly in the sky. Don't mention meat. It's nauseating. Even though he didn't swallow the meat porridge, he tasted it. Every time he thought about it, it made his stomach turn. After a short period of dizziness, LV Zheng stood up straight and let go of her hand. He observed her secretly. Just like Jiang Pengji's narcissism, she hadn't changed much over the years. Previously, LV Zheng had rejected Fang Zhi's persuasion. LV Zheng didn't agree to recruit him, but he also took the opportunity to catch up with his classmate. The two middle-aged men, who were already in their 30s, gathered together to chat by candlelight and reminisce about the past. They sighed with emotion and also talked about the situation of the Langya F5 heavenly group. From a teenager to a young man to a middle-aged man, everyone except Jiang Pengji had changed beyond recognition. The shy and lofty Fang Zhi had been tempered by reality into a steady and dignified country teacher. The hot-bloodedness that had been boiling in his chest during his youth had been defeated by reality. Jiang Imo, who was addicted to 2D paper dolls and loved all kinds of fire-repelling maps, and had a slightly cowardly personality, had become a profound, introverted, and reliable clan leader of the Shi family. He, who had been noisy and refused to submit to his family in the past, had also followed the example of his parents. Ma Xiao, a wealthy gentleman with good farmland and no worries about food and drink, had been affected by the chaos of war. His farmland had been occupied and plundered by bandits who rose to power. In order to avoid disaster, he had no choice but to move his family north. There had been no news of him for many years. Of course, the three of them hadn't changed much. Among the five, Jiang Pengji and LV Zheng had changed the most. Jiang Pengji, who was the most hedonistic and mischievous, had become a vassal of the world. LV Zheng, who had the potential to be a nationalistic youth and was biased against the gentry, had become Jiang Pengji's strategist for the safety of her family. Now, he had become Jiang Pengji's prisoner. Life was really interesting. No one knew what their future would be like until the very last moment. Okay. I won't talk about it anymore. Jiang Pengji's observation skills weren't just for show. She could tell from LV Zheng's reaction that he was hiding something. Naturally, she wouldn't continue to provoke him. An appropriate amount of playfulness was called playfulness. Excessive playfulness was called enmity. Look at your sickly and haggard appearance. It's better to stay in the military camp and wait for the war to end. Recuperate. Maybe I'll let you see your old master for the last time. After Jiang Pengji finished speaking, she suddenly remembered something. Right, I have something to tell you. LV Zheng was well aware of Jiang Pengji's arrangements, so he wasn't surprised. However, what she said made LV Zheng a little flustered for no reason. What's the matter? Jiang Pengji said, I asked for something from your adopted daughter. LV Zheng raised his eyebrows and asked, what is it? Jiang Pengji said, your study notes. What do you want that for? Chapter 1677. Send his former master back to heaven? Lu Xing didn't know what to do for a moment, but he was smart enough to figure out what she had done in no time. Lu Lanting. Lu Xing pointed at her. He was so angry that his hand was trembling. Jiang Pengji had a smile on her face. She raised her hand unhurriedly and pushed his hand aside. What are you trying to say? Are you despicable? Or are you cunning? She laughed. There's nothing too deceitful in a war. On the battlefield, all kinds of scheming methods were allowed. The only thing that mattered was who was more skilled. I'm just taking advantage of the situation to achieve my goal. Moreover, I'm giving you a credit so that you can quickly gain a foothold here. Lu Xing said, do you think I, Lu Xiaoyin, am a fickle and petty person who forgets about morality for the sake of profit? Lu Xing knew what Jiang Pengji had done. It was definitely a trap that could bury An Shui alive. I've never doubted your character, but, a fine bird chooses a tree to nest in, and a virtuous official chooses a master to serve. Do you not know what kind of person An Shui is? Whether he's worthy of you hanging him with a piece of white silk? Jiang Pengji said confidently, if you're a foolishly loyal person, just pretend I didn't say anything. Whether you stay or leave, I'll let you choose. Jiang Pengji naturally wanted to recruit Lu Xing. No one would complain about having too many talented people. After a while, she would conquer Nanxing and rule over the 5 countries in the world. She would need more and more people. Lu Xing knew her background, so he felt more at ease using her. He treated the surrendered officials of Langyi Academy well, and she was an alumnus of Langyi Academy. This was double insurance. Master Yuanjing had taught at Langyi Academy for many years. He had students all over the world and made friends with many famous scholars. With double insurance, it would be much easier to recruit people from this circle in the future. Jiang Pengji naturally would not fall out with Lu Zheng due to all these reasons. "You're forcing me to betray An Shui." Lu Zheng had voluntarily given up on An Shui and Jiang Pengji had forced him to do so. She had even made him the scapegoat for betraying An Shui. Even if An Shui was a scumbag, Lu Zheng had chosen him. Even if it was a stone in the latrine pit, Lu Zheng didn't want to be forced to throw the stone back into the latrine pit. Jiang Pengji said, "How can this be considered as coercion? What I'm doing is a stratagem, a normal confrontation of schemes. If no one in An Shui's camp sees through it, even if they fall into the pit and die, it's their own fault. We can only blame ourselves for being too weak and stupid. How can we blame the enemy for being too strong and smart?" Lu Zheng took a deep breath and asked, "What did you do to imitate my handwriting?" Even if LV Zheng did not like to praise Jiang Pengji, she would open a dye house just because he gave her some color. LV Zheng had to admit that she deserved to be envied by the heavens. She had a talent for imitating others. Based on what Jiang Pengji had just said, it wasn't difficult to deduce that Jiang Pengji must have taken the books he had written recently. Based on the handwriting on them, she imitated the letters to lure An Shui. As for LV Zheng was not sure what the contents of the letter were and what trap Jiang Pengji had dug. Jiang Pengji said, "Oh, I'm helping him come up with strategies and share his burdens. Isn't An Shui severely short of rations recently? There's a problem with the logistics rations, and the frontline army is facing the crisis of running out of rations. How can they fight a war when they don't have enough rations? So I imitated your handwriting and tone and came up with a simple idea. I asked him to lead his troops to attack my granary. I was worried that he wouldn't be able to find the way, so I specially drew a simple map." LV Zheng closed his eyes after listening to her. This was a fatal blow. How could An Shui take the bait? Jiang Pengji asked in return, "Why not? Xiaofan, do you have any misunderstandings about your own weight? Your master Yuanjing student, a top student who graduated from Langyi Academy. You've assisted An Shui, a penniless stray dog, to accumulate the wealth you have today. Even if An Shui has given you the cold shoulder over the past 2 years and even detested you, he will instinctively trust you when he's in a life-and-death situation. Without your assistance, LV Xiaofan, An Shui would still be a small character leading a few thousand grassroots troops. How could he have the glory he has today?" LV Zheng had helped An Shui launch a counterattack once, so he could naturally help him launch a counterattack a second time. Jiang Pengji said, "Xiaofan, I imitated your handwriting and wrote a wonderful plan. It's bait. How could An Shui not take the bait?" LV Zheng was reluctant to admit it, but he had to admit in his heart that Jiang Pengji was right. An Shui had been forced into a dead end, and Hua Yuan was still stabbing him in the back. He had no other choice but to believe in the plan. Of course, An Shui was a cautious and suspicious person. He might not believe everything. "Aren't you afraid of going for wool and coming home shorn? You failed to ambush An Shui, and you'll lose your granary." Why did LV Zheng, Cheng Jing, and the others have a problem with Jiang Pengji? Did the students of Langyi Academy not think highly of this schoolmate? Purely from the perspective of character, Jiang Pengji was a rather likable person. Even if she was the most despicable, she knew her limits, which became her unique shining point. However, making friends and assisting a vassal were different. The criteria for judging the two were also different. Friends could be mischievous and mischievous, but the Lord could not. LV Zheng did not know how Wei Ci and the others tolerated it. For example, this time, she used her own granary as bait to lure An Shui. If the other party counterattacked, An Shui would not be afraid of anything, but what about her? Jiang Pengji revealed a somewhat weary and mocking smile. "Xiaofan, you're underestimating me. I dared to set a trap, so naturally I have something to rely on." She asked in return, have you ever seen a banker lose? LV Zheng's heart skipped a beat. This chaotic world has lasted for too long. It's time to end it. We'll start with Nanxing, then Zhongzhou. Once we take down these two countries, the remaining two are nothing to fear. Those who once looked down on me and hated me can only watch me ascend to the throne. It's quite satisfying to think about it. LV Zheng knew that Jiang Pengji was not joking. What does this world mean to you? We're all old classmates. I won't say pretty things like let the people live and work in peace and contentment, and clarify the chaotic world. Anyway, you can tell that I'm lying. Jiang Pengji said, as for me, I want those who are dead and alive to open their eyes wide and see who's qualified to be the ruler of the world. Those who aren't convinced should hold it in. At the same time, I'll open their eyes and see what the real golden age looks like. Apart from me, none of them can do it. Not only will the predecessors be left in the dust, but the successors will also not be able to catch up. LV Zheng spat out 2 words softly. Arrogant. His ambition was written all over his face. Jiang Pengji made a gesture of shaking off her cigarette smoke. She smiled and raised her eyebrows. Xiaoyin, I'll give you a warning. LV Zheng was speechless. Even though he did not know what a warning from Zhenxiang was, he had a feeling that it would not be anything good. Recuperate well. I'm going to meet an old friend. Chapter 1678. I'd like to see Zixiao. Jiang Pengji didn't find Lu Zheng's request excessive, so she agreed. Anything else? My adopted daughter likes you very much, but she had a rough childhood and has a strange temperament. If she offends you in any way, please forgive her and ask the soldiers under your command to treat her better. Lu Zheng pondered for 3 seconds and said hesitantly, she's a child with a hard life. Jiang Pengji's gaze revealed some surprise. She thought Lu Zheng would say something else, such as rebuking her or asking about her attitude toward An Shui. She never expected him to plead for his adopted daughter. Jiang Pengji didn't pay attention to Kong Xintong at first, but since Lu Zheng said so, she naturally had to take care of her. She paid more attention to her. I'll send someone to send her to you. You can supervise her together and save some manpower. Jiang Pengji's words sounded impolite, but LV Zheng knew what she was really trying to express. Kong Xintong was Lu Zheng's adopted daughter, so she took care of him more meticulously than others. She placed Kong Xintong under his watch so that Lu Zheng wouldn't worry about his adopted daughter's situation when he was sick. Jiang Pengji arranged for Lu Zheng to recuperate in a secluded place. She also reminded the doctor not to be stingy with medicine and to use whatever was useful. When Wei Xi heard the news and rushed over, Lu Zheng was wearing a greenish-gray cloak and kneeling in front of the chessboard, playing chess. Sometimes he furrowed his brows in deep thought, sometimes he was suddenly enlightened, and sometimes he pointed at the chessboard to calculate something. He didn't look like a prisoner at all. Wei Xi saw that Lu Zheng looked sick and said disapprovingly, I heard that you're very sick. Why don't you wait on the bed? Instead of resting, he was playing chess. Any doctor who encountered such an uncooperative patient would be angry. Lu Zheng had long heard Wei Xi's movements. When he heard Wei Xi scolding him, he looked up at him. You haven't changed much over the years. Lu Zheng placed the chess record by his side and gestured for Wei Xi to sit on the mat opposite him. Wei Xi almost didn't recognize him. Lu Zheng looked much more haggard than he imagined. He was in low spirits and his hair was visibly gray. There was not much of a difference in their ages, but when Wei Xi and Lu Zheng were compared, the latter seemed to be almost 10 years older than the former. Wei Xi said frankly, you look much older. LV Zheng had the urge to treat the chess piece as Wei Xi and crush it. One is marked by the company one keeps, one is blackened by the company one keeps. Lu Zheng was implying something. Wei Si had been with Jiang Pengji for a long time. How did his glib tongue change toward the latters? Wei Si did not know about the bet between Jiang Pengji and Lv Zheng, but he was good at reading people's minds. Lv Zheng's words carried a subtle meaning. After hesitating for 3 breaths, Wei Si asked cautiously, "Does Xiaoyin know?" "It's hard not to know." Lu Zheng's fingernails were well manicured. At this moment, he was playing with a black chess piece, which made his fingernails look even paler. He placed the chess piece in the designated position and said, "How could Lu Shi be worthy of your attention? Back then, you were quite distant from her. After all, they were from the same sect and were taught by the same teacher." Lu Zheng's understanding of Wei Si was incomparable to that of an outsider. In the eyes of an outsider, they might think that Jiang Pengji was forcing Wei Si and that Wei Si had no choice but to succumb to her tyrannical power. However, Lu Zheng understood that if Wei Si had no intentions towards others, he would not easily succumb even if a knife was placed on his neck, let alone using force. The two of them had an affair. It could only be said that both of them were interested in each other. Not to mention Jiang Pengji, Lu Zheng had heard Jiang Pengji say that she would drag Wei Si down with her 800 years ago. But what about Wei Si? When did he develop feelings for Jiang Pengji that were beyond that of a ruler and an official? Wei Si said, "Maybe it was in my previous life." He told the truth, but Lu Zheng thought that he was being glib. Instead of learning from the good, you learn from the bad. Are you learning from Lu Shi in your eloquence? Lu Zheng gestured for Wei Si to choose a chess piece to play with him. Among his fellow apprentices, Wei Si's chess skills were the best among them. Lu Zheng was ranked last and was often beaten by Wei Si, Qing Jing, and Han Yu. The shadows of his school days were Jiang Pengji and Wei Si's, playing a game of chess with their hands. He was always beaten badly. In order to avenge his previous humiliation, he put in a lot of effort in this aspect. He did not know if he could gain an advantage today. Wei Si was speechless. No one believed him when he told the truth. It was not easy to be an honest person. The two of them did not talk much. They just played 2 games in silence. Lu Zheng still lost miserably. After cleaning up the mess, Lu Zheng looked up at Wei Si, whose temperament was becoming more and more stable. He was like a pearl that had been polished until it became rounder. Although it was not dazzling, it could not be ignored. This person looked like a decent person. Who could guess that he had tons of evil ideas in his mind? I will be careful about the matter with the Lord. I will try not to affect her as much as possible. I will also try to protect myself. He wanted to accompany her until her hair turned white and she died of old age. Both of them would be fine. Lu Zheng nodded. My teacher often says that you have your own views. Since you have said so, you must have made up your mind. It is not good for outsiders to persuade you. He was Wei Si's fellow apprentice, so his standpoint was naturally more biased towards Wei Si. As long as it was Wei Si's own choice, Lu Zheng would respect it. But, he could have chosen anyone to have a relationship with, but he chose Jiang Pengji, who was the most difficult to conquer. She was a vassal now, but she would become an emperor in the future. Her identity meant that if Wei Si wanted to walk to her side, there would be thorns under his feet. Maybe he would kneel halfway. Thank you. Wei Si's words came from the bottom of his heart. Whether it was Lu Zheng, Qing Jing, or Han Yu, their respect and understanding warmed Wei Si's heart. Lu Zheng stroked the cold chess piece and let out a sigh. He said to Wei Si, I know that you have a soft temperament and some things can't be said openly. Since we are from the same school, I will say one more thing. Lu Shi's temperament is different from ordinary people. If you really want to be in harmony with her, remember this, don't get involved in anything. In the future, whether it is the civil and military infighting or the struggle between the gentry and the common people, you'd better not intervene and don't express your opinion. If you really can't help it, it is best to ask for Lu Shi's opinion. Don't do anything that goes against her will. Ordinary couples have some difficulties and quarrels at most. But if you have a conflict with Lu Shi, it will affect more than just a small family. Lu Zheng's words were not only the way of a ruler and a minister, but also the way of a husband and wife. As long as Wei Xi always stood by her side and supported her, their interests would be firmly bound. Harming Wei would be harming Jiang Pengji's interests. In this way, she would become Wei Xi's most powerful shield. Wei Xi was stunned after hearing that. If he had understood this in his previous life, he would not have thought himself clever and got involved in the affairs of the Wei family. Would the meteorite have fallen from the sky? Most likely not. Chapter 1679. If Lu Zheng and the others were still alive in his previous life, they might have pointed out the right path for Wei Xi like they were doing now. The onlookers saw the game more clearly than the onlookers. Their advice was what Wei Xi needed the most so that he would not take the wrong path. However, it was not too late now. He had learned his lesson from his previous life and would not repeat the same mistake in this life. Don't be ostentatious. That's for the best. Otherwise, you'll become the target of public criticism. Lu Zheng rubbed the chess piece and smiled. Look at Lu Shi's subordinates. Other than those from Lang Yi's faction, the others may not be very friendly to you. Without a handle, they will have fewer reasons to attack you. Even if Wei Xi was from an academy, if he stood in their way, he might be stabbed in the back. To put it bluntly, interests were the foundation of a relationship. If their interests were the same, they would be allies forever. Wei Xi coughed lightly and reminded him, "My lord doesn't like to form cliques. Because of this, Yumo is still helping my teacher." Qing Jing refused to become an official mainly because he was worried that he would implicate his fellow disciples from Lang Yi Academy. When Lu Zheng casually said the words Lang Yi's faction, Wei Xi trembled with fear. It's one thing to dislike him, but it's another thing to form a clique. Lu Shi's temperament was too wild and arrogant. She might not take the so-called clique seriously. So what if they form cliques? Can they escape her grasp? As long as they do not cross the line, she will most likely not make a big fuss. If they cross the line, even if they do nothing, she will still find a reason to get rid of them. Yumo is too cautious. Lu Zheng sneered. That's why. Lu Lanting is really not a likable person. Humility and politeness were the main qualities. Someone like Jiang Pengji, who could not wait to write, "I'm the best in the world," on her face to attract hatred, was naturally not likable. She was a heretic. Lu Zheng even had some malicious thoughts. He hoped that Jiang Pengji would fail miserably. Sooner or later, she will fail miserably. If she failed miserably, he wondered what expression she would have. Although he did not want to admit it, he had to admit that Lu Zheng's judgment was correct. Whether it was His Majesty in his previous life or his lord in this life, both were so confident that they were conceited. Why would she care about the clique of her subordinates? If someone really did violate her taboo by forming a clique, needless to say, they would end up with weeds growing 3 feet high on their graves. Thinking back to his past life, the relationship between the officials in the imperial court was indeed a little subtle. Wei Xi even suspected that the other party had deliberately allowed the officials to form a clique. If they stepped over her bottom line, she would strike violently and wipe them all out. Thinking along this line of thought, it was extremely terrifying. The Jiang dynasty had been established for 18 years. During this period of time, there had been several changes of power, and every time there was the shadow of His Majesty enforcing the law. Toying with the entire imperial court with the strength of one person. Lu Zheng wanted to see his lord fail miserably in such an easy task, but he was probably daydreaming. Why don't Xiao Yin give her more confidence? Wei Xi said, "She can do it." Lu Zheng had an indescribable expression on his face. He gritted his teeth and said, "The husband follows the wife. I'm afraid of you." Wei Ci pursed his lips and smiled faintly. The light enveloped him and it seemed that even his skin was suffused with a faint halo. He looked like a deity. How could there be such a good-looking man in this world? Kang Xintong suddenly thought. Wei Ci's smile froze halfway. Look, who did he discover? Wei Ci's expression was as usual. Lu Zheng waved at his adopted daughter who was standing in the corridor and did not dare to enter the house. Xintong, come over and meet Uncle Master. Kang Xintong only came back to her senses when she heard the summons. She hurriedly but restrained herself and bowed. Niece greets Uncle Master. Lu Zheng introduced, I adopted her a while ago. She's smart and talented. The key is that she's filial and sensible. What do you think, Zixiao? He was like a father showing off his daughter and gleefully looked forward to hearing praises from Wei Ci. Wei Ci secretly raised his eyebrows. What's her name? Kang Xintong said, my niece's surname is Kang. My courtesy name is Xintong. Wei Ci pretended to be curious and asked, where did Xiaofan find such a lovely adopted daughter? Lu Zheng thought that Wei Ci had misunderstood this father-daughter relationship and explained vaguely, in the future, I still need to count on her to provide for me when I'm old. Naturally, I have to find a filial daughter. As for where I found her, I can only say that it's fate. She's the only one in the world. You can't be envious. Many rich families did not have the right to take in concubines. However, there were policies and countermeasures. There would always be people who could find loopholes and come up with excuses. For example, adopted daughter or study boy. They could be very pure characters, but they could also be special characters with other colors. Lu Zheng said the words provide for me when I'm old. Naturally, this father-daughter relationship was very serious. It's our first time meeting. I'm not prepared. Wei Ci fished out a small thing from his sleeve and gave it to Kang Xintong. His gentle gaze fell on the latter and he said apologetically, this gift is a little shabby. I'll give you a formal one in the future. Kang Xintong did not take it. She secretly observed Lu Zheng's expression and only accepted it happily when he nodded. Lu Zheng said, this uncle master of yours is a rare talent in the world. If I don't have time to teach you, you can look for him. When the day comes that you've drained all the ink in his stomach and stirred up a storm in the future, there will be a place for you. Learn more, understand? Yes, I understand. Wei Ci smiled awkwardly but politely. The future saint of the Red Lotus group had become his niece. Could the world be more magical? As it turned out, there was. When he saw Kang Xintong pour him tea and obediently, Wei Ci felt as if he was sitting on pins and needles. His memories of the past decades were all blurred. Only some special events and people were as vivid as before. Kang Xintong was one of them. As a serious rebel, Kang Xintong had a close relationship with many courtiers as the saint of the Red Lotus group. She knew their weaknesses and was a criminal that needed special treatment. If one wanted to dig out secrets from such a person's mouth, they would have to be tortured. Many people could not endure it and gave up, but Kang Xintong was an exception. Wei Ci could not be bothered to investigate Kang Xintong's background. In his opinion, she was a traitor. Coincidentally, Kang Xintong was also unwilling to reveal her unbearable past to gain sympathy. She was stubborn and stubborn. As long as I'm still breathing, don't even think about getting a word out of me. After 3 days of torture, she had almost tasted all the punishments in the dungeon, but she still did not give up a single word. Wei Ci presented this matter to His Majesty. His Majesty was interested and condescended to take a look at the dungeon. His Majesty looked at Kang Xintong, who was bathed in prison clothes and said softly, why bring the secret underground and use your life to cover up the crimes of those people? I thought that the Red Lotus group was just a motley crew. They knew nothing but dancing and playing tricks. I didn't expect there to be an exception like you. Kong Shintong coughed up blood and said mockingly, if I don't tell them, they will live in fear and remember me for the rest of their lives. His Majesty raised his eyebrows. If you die, everyone in the world remembers. But if I die, it will be as quiet as an ant disappearing. If they can remember me, then I won't have lived in vain. His Majesty said, I understand. Do you have any wishes? Kong Shintong would rather die than confess. There was no value in continuing to torture this kind of criminal. Chapter 1680. You want to be cremated? Everyone thought death was the same as the soul. If cremation was used, it would be the same as burning the bones and scattering the ashes. Other than Kong Shintong, this was the first time Her Majesty heard someone ask for it. When I was born, it was snowing heavily in Nanxing for 20 years. I heard from the servants that the sky and the earth were one color and the vast expanse of whiteness. After 3 consecutive days of torture, if Kong Shintong's willpower was not stronger than that of ordinary people, her soul would have long gone to hell. Her voice was as weak as a mosquito. Her words sounded more like she was talking to herself. I've seen corpses rotting. Rotten flesh turning into water, maggots eating bones. No matter how beautiful a beauty is, she can't escape such an ending. I was born clean. I don't want to be dirty after death. Isn't it better to be burned? Her Majesty said, as you wish. In the end, Kong Shintong burned herself to death wearing the prisoner's clothes that were dyed red with blood like a wedding gown. No matter how many evil things this woman did when she was alive, death was like an extinguished lamp. Wei Ci saw her die in the raging fire with his own eyes, so he didn't continue to pay attention to her. Time flew and years came again. He didn't expect to see her again. Wei Ci thought that since there were so many changes in this life, Kong Shintong might have died early in the disaster of Nanman. Even if she survived, her fate would most likely be different from her previous life and she wouldn't be able to cause any trouble. He never expected that she would become Lu Zheng's adopted daughter. Wei Ci, who had always disliked gossiping, was a little curious. He beat around the bush and asked how Lu Zheng had managed to take them in. Be a good husband. Lu Zheng looked at him sideways and warned him calmly, you're a man with a family. Wei Ci almost choked on Lu Zheng's words. Just now there was a brotherly love between them. How did they end up hurting each other in the blink of an eye? He dared to bet that Lu Zheng learned the term husband's way from his lord. What are you thinking about, Xiaofan? Wei Ci couldn't help but interrupt to prevent Lu Zheng from letting his imagination run wild. I only saw that this woman's face is strange and her birth chart is also strange. That's why I asked. Since she's your adopted daughter, she's your junior. Why would an elder have any thoughts about a little girl who hasn't reached marriageable age? Moreover, this matter isn't something to joke about. My lord will take it seriously. Lu Zheng was stunned. He had forgotten that Wei Ci was a quack. There's something wrong with Shintong's physiognomy? After all, she was his adopted daughter, and Lv Zheng did not want anything to happen to her. If he could avoid it, he would try his best to avoid it. Wei Ci said, beauties are full of ups and downs. Needless to say, Lu Zheng naturally understood. He faintly sighed and concisely explained Kong Shintong's past experiences. Wei Ci's words, beauties are full of ups and downs, matched Kong Shintong's previous experience. Naturally, Lu Zheng did not doubt it. This is also a child with a hard life. If it was possible, Lu Zheng naturally hoped that Kong Shintong would agree to his request. You said that her appearance is strange and her birth chart is also strange. Could it be that there are other variables? Was it a blessing or a curse? Will we be able to turn misfortunes into blessings in the future? Wei Ci said, she met a benefactor and her destiny changed greatly. It will be better than what she had originally planned. Lu Jing smiled and said, now that you've said that, I'm relieved. While they were talking, Kong Shintong had already prepared dinner. Wei Ci conveniently stayed behind to freeload. After dinner, the sky gradually darkened. Kong Shintong stood up to send Wei Ci off on behalf of her adoptive father, Lu Zheng. She was so nervous on the way that she could not speak. After she watched Wei Ci leave, she hurriedly went to look for her adoptive father. Adoptive father, are we going to stay here from now on? She had thought that she would be imprisoned, but she did not expect that the treatment after being captured by the enemy was better than staying at Shui's side. If she had known earlier, she would have continued to persuade her adoptive father to change jobs. Lu Jing felt that it was better to have a short-term pain than a protracted one. He frowned and drank the bitter medicine. He did not know if it was an illusion, but he felt that the medicine prescribed by the doctor was much more bitter than the medicine he had drunk before. You look rather happy. Lu Jing could not help but remind his adoptive daughter. They were now prisoners, what was there to be happy about? Kong Shintong said, I observed that martial uncle. He has a good temperament. If we become colleagues in the future, wouldn't it be much better than before? Lu Zheng was speechless. How much did his adoptive daughter despise her lord, Shui? After a while, Kong Shintong cleared the dishes for him and suddenly thought of something. Adoptive father, adoptive father. What's the matter? Speak. Kong Shintong asked, did Master Lanting personally come to recruit you? His adoptive father was a talented person with a strong presence. The Master of Lanting would surely come personally to show his respect. Lu Zheng turned to look at his adoptive daughter, an indescribable feeling in his heart. What if the child always sided with an outsider? It was fine. She was most likely retarded. A beating would be enough. Of course, Lu Zheng could not bring himself to beat the child. He could only suppress his feelings. It was not enough that Lu Lanting had harmed Wei Ci and him. Now that she had become capable, she had harmed his adoptive daughter. Ha, what a sentimental and promiscuous woman. Lu Zheng sneered coldly. Jiang Pengji sneezed loudly. Her eyes looked even more watery. It was the season change, and the number of sick people was much higher than usual. Li Yun and the others were worried that their lord would be affected. They asked with concern, are you feeling unwell, my lord? Jiang Pengji waved her hand and rubbed her nose. I'm fine. My nose suddenly itched. Li Yun and the others relaxed when they saw that her expression was normal. Jiang Pengji said, tonight, Shui and the others will definitely send men to launch a sneak attack. Is the granary ready? Li Yun replied, General Fu has already brought men to set up an ambush. It's guaranteed that nothing will go wrong. Shui had already run out of ammunition and food. Jiang Pengji had pointed out a clear path. Shui, who had nowhere else to go, had no choice but to take the bait. Tell Zheng to not to be careless. Whether this battle can end cleanly depends on him, Jiang Pengji reminded him. Jiang Pengji exhorted. She had no intention of getting involved. Li Yun cupped his fists and said, understood. Jiang Pengji did not personally lead the troops to set up an ambush, but she did not wait quietly in the tent for news either. Houchi Gatue Z, TSK, didn't the streamer say that she would not wander the battlefield? Yes, Hen Fengquang, judging from the streamer's posture, it doesn't seem like she's going to lead the troops to smash Shui's head. The idle people thought that Jiang Pengji was going to return to the martial world. Who knew that she would only lead 1,000 troops out to guard a certain mountain valley? Just as they were puzzled, Jiang Pengji opened her mouth to explain. Chapter 1681. After all, Jiang Pengji was born in the army. Even if she retired from the front line, it didn't mean that she was completely away from the battlefield. She just didn't take the lead like she used to. Zhang Jike's table tennis. Is the streamer worried that Fu Wang and the others will fail miserably? She's here to hold the line for them. Jiang Pengji said sarcastically, this credit is free. It's not difficult at all. If Fu Wang can't even handle such a small matter, he'll be sent back to his hometown to plant sweet potatoes. I'm worried about them. Why should I be worried about a few good-for-nothings? Yueying, #carrot. Carrot hashtag, I can't get tired of seeing the streamer's hypocritical and arrogant look. If you push Fu Wang to the end and send him back to his hometown to plant sweet potatoes, who will get Sister Huijuan's alimony, milk powder, diapers, and education fees? Even after so many years, the salted fish still couldn't let go of the fact that Fu Wang, the pig trotter, had stolen their love. For the sake of the cute twins, they reluctantly accepted Fu Wang. Jiang Pengji said, worried about them? No, I'm just supervising the battle. The salted fish were used to Jiang Pengji's hypocrisy. After all, the stubborn streamer was also their favorite. She was a treasure in the world. It was dark and quiet everywhere. Only the sound of the patrolling cavalry's hooves and the crackling of the torches could be heard. Fu Wang wore a dignified and heavy armor with beast rings. It made his burly body look like a small mountain. The march was tough. He could only squeeze out time to clean his face for half a month. The last time he shaved was 8 days ago. Because he hadn't shaved for a long time, the green stubble on his cheeks was a little long and messy. The helmet pressed against his stubble, making him very uncomfortable. If he wasn't rational, he would have pulled out the long knife at his waist and shaved his face. Xia Zhe patrolled everywhere. When he came back to report, he found Fu Wang scratching his face from time to time. He thought he had been bitten by a mosquito in the forest. I still have some insect repellent powder here. Would General Fu like to use some? Xia Zhe took off the medicine bag hanging at his waist and handed it to Fu Wang. Fu Wang was stunned. After 2 breaths, he realized Xia Zhe had misunderstood. He waved his hand and said, it's not a mosquito bite. I don't need it. Xia Zhe looked surprised and asked curiously, then why does General Fu keep scratching his face? Fu Wang said with some embarrassment, my stubble is pricking my face, and I didn't bring my razor with me. Xia Zhe, what could he do? Naturally, he revealed an awkward but polite smile. Fu Wang was not considered young among the crowd, but everyone realized that he had yet to grow a beard. No matter how busy he was with the war, he would still squeeze out half a day to comb the stubble on his face. Although not growing a beard did not diminish Fu Wang's manliness, others always felt that something was missing. Xia Zhe asked curiously. Fu Wang said faintly, my family doesn't like it. They say it's irritating. The appearance of the twins took after Huijun. Their skin was tender and smooth. Fu Wang would sneak a kiss and it would always make the child cry. Over time, the child did not like to be close to him. In desperation, Fu Wang could only give up on the idea of growing a beard and shave every other day. It was fine if he didn't have a beard or had a long beard, but the most annoying thing was a beard that was neither too long nor too short, and the helmet stuck close to his face to protect his cheeks. Xia Zhe said, it sounds very envious. Fu Wang puffed out his chest and said, of course. Another advantage of not growing a beard was that he looked young. Ever since he had snuck into Huijuan's household, Fu Wang hated it when people talked about his age. Even though he was not much stronger than Huijun, the age difference still made Fu Wang feel insulted. He wished that they were the same age. The two of them chatted for a while before they tacitly stopped and talked about the results of the patrol. They all knew that they had to perform meritorious deeds tonight. If they made a mistake, the Lord would skin them alive. Fu Wang was the most cowardly one. Why? Because he was henpecked. If Hui Jun knew that he was a burden to the Lord, the scene would be unimaginable. Fu Wang and the others were well prepared and naturally had a card up their sleeves. Everything was ready, except for the enemy. Fu Wang did not wait long before the dull sound of horse hooves came from afar. To ensure the success of this ambush, the warhorses' hooves were tied with cloth strips to reduce the sound when they landed. "General Fu, there's movement. TSK, you really can't stand being talked about." A sneer appeared on Fu Wang's face as he suddenly stood up and mounted his horse. He ordered, "Send the order to inform everyone to be on high alert. Not a single fish can escape the net today." "Yes." Fu Wang and Xie Zhe were in charge of different areas. The former was in charge of attack, while the latter was in charge of encirclement and suppression. The two worked together to attack the enemy from the front and back. The night wind was bleak and the shadows of the trees swayed. The numerous shadows seemed to blend into the night. If it was just to destroy the granary, Shui would only need to send 1,000 men and horses. It would be easy to expose the target if there were too many people, but his goal was to rob the rations to replenish himself. Naturally, he could not have too few troops. Otherwise, even if they robbed the rations, they would not have enough men to transport them away. In order to motivate the three armies, Shui even gambled and made a bold decision. He decided to lead the troops in a night attack. Of course, this night attack could not be compared to Jiang Pengji's magnificent feat. To put it bluntly, it was to follow in the center of the army. No matter if they advanced or retreated, there would be room. It was the safest. Even so, Shui was somewhat reluctant. After all, not everyone was like Jiang Pengji, a monster who would feel uncomfortable if she did not fight or kill. Shui valued his own life the most. Why would he risk his life? However, he had no choice but to do this. The morale of the entire army was low. Recently, deserters had been ceaselessly coming in. A rough estimate was that they had lost more than 10,000 low-ranking soldiers. How could he increase morale? After thinking about it, the only way was to go into battle personally. Jiang Pengji's imitation of Lu Zheng's letter was flawless. The rough map given was also real. Shui led 30,000 carefully selected elites and set off. Along the way, they did not discover anything suspicious. As the army went deeper, Shui's confidence grew exponentially. If we succeed this time, Xiaofan should be rewarded. Shui sighed with emotion. Even though he and Lu Zheng no longer had feelings for each other, Lu Zheng was still loyal to him and plotted for him in every way. Thinking of their old friendship, Shui's heart softened a little. He planned to continue using Lu Zheng after he recovered from his illness. Even if Lu Zheng was dissatisfied with him, so what? He was the ruler, and Lu Zheng was the subject. The ruler ruled by the subject. Could Lu Zheng overturn the heavens? With this thought in mind, Shui let down his guard slightly. He could relax, but the others did not dare. After marching for more than 2 hours, half of the night had passed. Shui and the others finally approached the location of the granary. Are there any abnormalities in the defenses here? Shui was a paranoid person. Once he discovered anything unusual, he would immediately turn around and leave. Reporting to my lord, there are no abnormalities. Chapter 1682. The heavens knew who the heavens were helping. Shui's one-sided statement did not count. Unfortunately, no one understood this. The deputy general guarding Shui cupped his fists and complimented him, making Shui feel elated. It was as if victory was close at hand. The atmosphere was just right, but there were still people who jumped out to ruin it. Shui pulled a long face when he heard this. Master, I've heard advisor Lu mention Lu Shi before. The advisor said that Lu Shi is a person who does things with caution. We can't use common sense to judge him. Also, the granary is related to the outcome of the battle. The defenses here must be very strict. Our army needs to be careful and cannot be careless. An Shui's expression darkened. His face grew long, and it was frightening to look at. The surrounding soldiers all wanted to hammer that weird person who couldn't read the atmosphere. Instead of saying something auspicious at a time like this, he was bringing bad luck to himself. Was he stupid? The deputy general who had spoken did not feel that he was bringing bad luck. He was doing this for the good of his master. He spoke from the bottom of his heart and was speaking the truth. Good advice was unpleasant to the ear. He had to listen even if he didn't like it. An Shui could only respond with an awkward but polite smile. He remembered this deputy general in his heart. Perhaps it was the influence of this crow's mouth, but An Shui's mood turned from sunny to cloudy. His heart seemed to be shrouded in a haze that could not be dispelled. It was as if something was going to happen soon. He couldn't explain it in detail. Because of this, An Shui was even more dissatisfied with this crow's mouth. An Shui was the master, not the vanguard. Naturally, he wouldn't be at the front lines. He could only judge the situation of the two armies based on his own eyes and the real-time battle reports. When he heard the shouts of killing coming from outside the granary, An Shui knew that the two armies had started fighting. He clenched his fists nervously and gritted his teeth. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. "How's the battle situation?" An Shui couldn't help but ask again. The results were very gratifying. While the granary's defenses were strong, the number of soldiers and horses stationed there was only a regular number. The overall situation was not too different from the information Lu Zheng had given him. Even though these guards were all elites, they were outnumbered by the enemy. After a while, they would be at a disadvantage. According to the current situation, it was expected that the granary would fall. In order to boost the morale of the troops, the general laughed out loud and mocked, "The troops under Lu Shi's tent are just so. I'll take a few more heads." As he listened to the shouts, An Shui's heart, which had been hanging in the air, slowly calmed down. He recalled the wonderful plan Lu Zheng gave him, and the amount of grain stored in the granary that Lu Zheng had deduced based on all kinds of information. He could not help but feel excited. If they could empty this granary, not only would they be able to deal a huge blow to the enemy's morale, but they would also be able to prolong their lives. Send reinforcements and take down the granary as soon as possible to avoid any accidents. This place was very far from the tents of Jiang Pengji's army, but they were also afraid that unforeseen events would occur if they delayed for too long. An Shui was afraid of Jiang Pengji. He always felt that this person was very strange. Every time he gained the upper hand, before he could feel proud of himself for a while, the other party would always jump out from all sorts of corners to slap him in the face. "Yes, sir. Increase the number of troops and strive to occupy the granary as fast as possible." The granary defense line wouldn't last much longer. As An Shui sent reinforcements, the already shaky defense line of the granary collapsed, and the soldiers guarding it scattered in all directions. "It's done." Unexpectedly, the unforeseen event happened not long after. While An Shui's main army was focused on attacking the granary, two groups of troops circled to the rear, one on the left and one on the right. "I've let them be complacent for long enough. It's time to wake up from this sweet dream." Fu Wang revealed a sinister smile. His pair of pitch-black eyes seemed to flicker with a frightening light. He was a wolf child raised by a pack of wolves. The night was a hindrance to others, but to him, it was like a fish in water. Fu Wang waved his hand, and a soldier immediately handed him a quiver of arrows. Disregarding the inhuman Jiang Pengji, Fu Wang's strength was among the best in the army. Fu Wang easily drew his two-pickle heavy bow and released several arrows in unison. The moment the arrows left the bowstring, the archers who had been on standby for a long time drew their bows fully. The small bamboo whistle tied to the arrow shafts flew into the sky, emitting a sharp sound. The whistling arrow was the signal. The soldiers of the archery battalion who had been lying in ambush drew their bows. The first wave of arrows flew towards the enemy. The arrows that Fu Wang shot accurately hit the enemy. Those who were shot only had time to let out their final screams, alerting the other soldiers. What's happening? The night was dark, and there were no torches lit in the surroundings. The soldiers who were further away did not see the arrows on the bodies of those who were shot. The soldiers who were closer saw it, but before they could shout out the word "enemy attack," the shrill sound of whistling arrows and the buzzing sound of arrows leaving the bowstring arrived one after the other. Fu Wang's side had taken the enemy by surprise. The other group led by Commander Xie was not to be outdone, and they also caused a commotion. By the time An Shui discovered the unusual movements coming from the rear of the army, it was already too late. Report: 2 groups of enemy troops have appeared behind our army. An Shui had been immersed in the joy of victory a second ago, but in the next second, he was pulled back to reality by the shouts of the messenger. What? Enemy troops? An Shui thought he was hearing things. Where did the enemy troops come from? The messenger could only repeat it once. This time, An Shui heard it clearly, but he was so shocked that his mind went blank. How could there be enemy troops? Jiangpengji's main camp was at least 14 to 16 hours away from here. Even if she had received news that the granary had been attacked and had grown wings to fly over, she would not make it in time. Unless... An Shui had a conjecture that made his limbs go cold. Unless the enemy had planned this beforehand and had predicted that An Shui would lead troops to launch a sneak attack, so they had set up an ambush in advance and were only waiting for them to walk right into the trap. Don't panic, my lord. I will repel them right away. The commotion at the rear was not small, but it would take a while for it to reach the front. The vanguard troops who had taken the lead broke through the defensive line. The provisions were right in front of them, and they saw the defeated soldiers fleeing in all directions. Their joy grew even stronger. Lu Shi is nothing more than this. The general of the vanguard laughed heartily as he led his men into the granary. Sure enough, it was filled to the brim with rations. He pulled out the dagger at his waist and cut open the nearest bag of rations. The yellow grains that he had expected did not flow out. Instead, a pile of gravel gushed out. The general's smile froze halfway. His right hand, which was holding the dagger, was trembling. We've fallen into a trap. Order the army to retreat quickly. He shouted at the top of his lungs, but it was still too late. At that moment, more than 2,000 soldiers had already rushed into the granary. The rest did not know what had happened inside. They kept rushing in, so how could they have the time to retreat? Kill! Suddenly, the sound of "kill" surged in from all directions like a tidal wave. The enemy troops who had fled in disorder had returned. Their numbers were many times greater than before. An Shui's army was shocked by the word "fall into a trap." The moment the enemy troops arrived, they immediately lost their composure and formation. In the distance, Jiangpengji looked at the spreading flames in the granary. The corners of her lips curled into a cold smile. Chapter 1683. Yuyita, receiving guests. Pfft. I should really let the little princesses from the group of little princesses see how stifled their lord is. Fireworks era, it's not just the streamer who's stifled. I've been stifled for a while too. The content of the streaming of swords and blades is more exciting. Of course, I'm not encouraging the streamer to be as unrestrained as before, but it's good to have some fun once in a while. Don't stifle yourself. Qingchen, when I heard the streamer say, receiving guests, I couldn't help but think of an alluring madam waving her handkerchief. The sense of déjà vu is too strong. Leo Ciji Lianmeng, to the previous poster, I think the two have the same effect, because both the streamer and the madam want people's lives. Even the salted fish in the streaming room had been edified into an old salted fish that raced on Mount Shuming, but a big shot was still a big shot. Her speed was extraordinary. In the blink of an eye, a car flew past. Jiang Pengji blocked the bullet screen and carefully waited for the fish that slipped through the net to crash into her. In comparison, An Chui's situation was much more difficult. There were enemy soldiers lying in ambush in front and behind him. This was not the worst. The worst thing was that the morale of the three armies was hanging by a thread. Everyone believed that this operation would be successful and that they would fight with their backs to the wall after the food crisis was resolved. Now that they had been ambushed by the enemy, their last breath was immediately deflated. Their morale had also collapsed. However, in the face of danger, they could only brace themselves and fight for a way out. Only then would there be a possibility of survival. The flames of war spread, and the killings shook the heavens. The morale of Jiang Pengji's side was as high as a rainbow. An Chui's side could only struggle with difficulty. Seeing that the tide was about to turn and that the flames of war were about to spread to An Chui's side, An Chui was burning with anxiety, but he was powerless. He only hated Jiang Pengji and Lu Zheng, who had presented him with the brilliant plan. Now that he thought about it carefully, it was most likely that Lu Zheng had used the excuse of leaving to seek refuge with Jiang Pengji. He had even used the brilliant plan to deceive An Chui into stepping into a trap. This guess was baseless, but An Chui could not think of any other possibility. He loved and hated Lu Zheng at the same time. His heart was filled with rage. An Chui felt that he had treated Lu Zheng well. Although he had given him the cold shoulder in the past 2 years, he had also ensured that Lu Zheng enjoyed a high position and wealth. He had never done something like burning the bridge after crossing it. He did not expect Lu Zheng to betray him and hook up with Jiang Pengji. An Chui kept saying that he trusted Lv Zheng and treated him well, but in reality, he was biased to the core. Lu Zheng's brilliant plan might not have come from Lu Zheng. Perhaps Lu Zheng had already met with misfortune. Unfortunately, An Chui didn't have the chance to think about this. He shouted, "Retreat! Lead the troops and break out of the encirclement." If he was caught, there was no point in fighting the war. The remaining territories of Nansheng would really fall into Jiang Pengji's hands. The group also realized the severity of the situation. They could only try their best to organize a counterattack and break out of the encirclement, attempting to escort An Chui out of the encirclement. Even if the soldiers under Jiang Pengji's command were of high quality, they were no match for the enemy's human wave tactic. The soldiers under An Chui's command focused on one direction to break out of the encirclement. They managed to tear a hole in the encirclement, but not too long after, the enemy came to fill the gap. Soon, the commotion here alarmed Fu Wang. "Report, what's the matter?" Fu Wang spat out a mouthful of blood. With a few slashes, he chopped a few obstructing enemies in half. The soldiers reported to Fu Wang that An Chui's side was gathering troops to break out of the encirclement, allowing Fu Wang to decide whether to continue intercepting them or go easy on them. The battlefield was so big that it was impossible to take care of every single area. There were bound to be places where troops had to be concentrated, and some places where they had to go easy on them to reduce the overall pressure. They had to use the limited number of troops to deal the greatest blow to the enemy. If they sent troops to fight to the death in one area, the troops in other areas would be thinned out. Even though the morale of An Chui's troops was low and their combat ability was not up to par, it did not mean that they would surrender without a fight. For example, An Chui's attempt to break out of the encirclement was very stressful. Many soldiers had been sacrificed to stop them. Fu Wang rubbed his chin with his blood-stained palm and muttered to himself. His hands, face, armor, and the warhorse he was riding, lightning chasing, were all stained with someone's blood. He looked as if he had crawled out of a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. It was very frightening. When he was deep in thought, his oppressive aura became even stronger. "Huh, looks like it's a big fish." Fu Wang picked up his weapon and urged his horse forward. "What are you waiting for? Grab your weapons and follow me." Fu Wang was a meticulous person despite his coarseness. The morale of Shui's troops was so low that they could not withstand a single blow, but the troops they had gathered to break out of the encirclement had almost torn apart their own army's defensive line. What did this mean? This meant that the person they were protecting had an extraordinary status. The soldiers had to raise their fighting spirit, which was why Fu Wang's side was feeling so pressured. With such a deduction, would Fu Wang let them go so easily? The people on Shui's side were the first to realize that something was wrong. The enemy was targeting them. When he realized this, Shui could not sit still. Riding on his warhorse, he gripped the reins tightly, his face so dark that it seemed as if it would drip water. "Master, the enemy has caught up." Fu Wang and the others were very fast, but because of the darkness, reinforcements could not come as quickly. Shui had managed to temporarily escape danger under the protection of the soldiers. Before they could celebrate, they discovered that the enemy had already caught up. They could only send out some troops to delay the enemy for a while. However, this method was not a long-term solution. On the way to escape, a soldier came up with an idea in a moment of desperation. He suggested that Shui take off his luxurious clothes and change into the tattered clothes of an ordinary soldier. His face would be smeared black, his hair messy, and he would disguise himself as an ordinary soldier. Even if the enemy caught up, Shui would blend into the chaotic army. As long as he did not admit his identity, no one would know that he was Duke Shui. This soldier could then disguise himself as Shui and confuse the enemy's eyes and ears, drawing their people away. This way, he could delay them for a while. Although this method was bad, it was a method that did not have a solution. For the sake of his own life, Shui had to agree. When he finished changing, he realized that something was wrong. However, time was of the essence. He did not have the luxury of time to think about it. "Sorry to trouble you, master." The soldier put on the clothes Shui had taken off, scratched his messy hair with his fingers, and turned back on his horse, leading the soldiers to delay the enemy. The soldiers split into two groups. One group would escort Shui to escape, while the other would use themselves as bait to attract the enemy's troops. Fu Wang was not a useless person. In a few moves, he had captured and killed the people on the second group. "General Fu, this is the big fish." The soldiers picked out the best dressed, the tallest, and the one with the most complete armor from among the captives. After identifying the captives, they finally caught the general who had put on Shui's clothes. This was probably the big fish that the enemy was carefully protecting. Fu Wang dismounted, grabbed a torch, and walked forward. He used the light to identify the man. "Who is this?" Fu Wang casually poked the torch in front of him, almost burning the man's eyebrows. The general in Shui's tent said, "I am Shui." "How dare you?" Holding the torch, Fu Wang froze. He almost cried out, "Is Shui personally leading the troops today?" The general. Chapter 1684. "No, that's not it." The general's face darkened, but it was too late to make up for it. Fu Wang would not listen to his excuses. Fu Wang walked up and used his free hand to violently wipe away the dirt on the general's face. He brought the torch in his right hand closer to examine it. He laughed coldly. "Ignorant child, don't you know that I've seen Shui before?" The general's mouth was bitter. How could he know that Fu Wang had seen Shui before? He had been exposed almost immediately. If that was all, it would have been fine, but he had made an extremely stupid mistake. Even if this ambush was a trap, they could not have known that Shui was personally leading the army. In other words, there was no need for the general to put on Shui's clothes to draw the enemy away. Not only would this not buy time, but it would also expose the fact that Shui was among the fleeing troops, drawing the enemy's pursuit. The correct method should have been for Shui to disguise himself as a fleeing soldier and use the chaos to escape into the dense forest. Only then would he have a chance to escape. In the end, because of the urgency of the situation, he had neglected this point and exposed his lord Shui's existence. Not only that, but this mighty general had seen Shui before. Once Shui was captured, there was basically no hope of escape. Thinking of this, the general was so regretful that he wanted to commit suicide. Fu Wang observed the captive's expression coldly. He had already figured it out. He had lied. Fu Wang had never seen Shui in person, only his portrait. He had lied to deceive the captive. Men. Fu Wang suppressed the wild joy in his heart. If he could capture Shui alive, how great of a contribution would that be? All men were ambitious, and Fu Wang was no exception. The general heard the commotion and hurried forward to receive orders. Fu Wang ordered him to send more men to hunt down the fleeing fish. You go first, I'll follow soon. Military merit was very attractive, but Fu Wang would not abandon the battlefield for military merit. What if he accidentally tricked Xiaofan? The general was ordered to retreat. When Shui's general heard this, his vision darkened and he almost fainted. Fu Wang glanced disdainfully at the captured enemy general. He was stupid, but he still thought himself clever. It was time for him to train his brain. The deputy general had been Fu Wang's right-hand man for many years. He had once followed Fu Wang's adoptive father, Fu Yang, when he was young. Now, he was also an experienced and prudent old man. Fu Wang was completely at ease leaving the heavy responsibility of pursuing Shui to him. Even if Si Jiang could not catch Shui, he would not let Shui escape so easily. Once Fu Wang settled the situation on this side, he would quickly catch up to them. Fu Wang's plan was undoubtedly very comprehensive, but he had forgotten one thing: his lord was focused on snatching the kill. On the other side of the story, Shui disguised himself as an ordinary soldier and was running for his life on horseback. There wasn't much light in the dark night. They could barely see the small path, but they couldn't see the specific road. Thus, this escape route was very bumpy. Under the whipping of the horse, the warhorse galloped forward with all its might. The oncoming night wind slapped against its face, causing it to hurt. Shui felt like vomiting from the jolting, but he didn't dare to stop the whip. He could only endure the paleness of his face and continue. Hiya! Shui whipped the warhorse under him again. The warhorse neighed in pain. Its front hooves suddenly missed their footing, and its strong body fell forward. They didn't know what it had touched, but the horse's leg made a bone-cracking sound. The warhorse's body fell heavily to the ground due to inertia. Shui was also thrown backward by the force of the fall. He rolled on the ground twice, his teeth scraping against the skin of his mouth. The thick taste of blood spread in his mouth. The others couldn't care less about the half-dead warhorse. They hurriedly pulled on the reins to stop the warhorse and dismounted to help Shui up. Shui's luck was pretty good. Even after such a heavy fall, he had only loosened his front teeth, seen stars, and suffered some superficial wounds. If he had been unlucky, his organs might have been displaced by the weight of the warhorse. "My lord! My lord!" Cries of "my lord" rang out in Shui's ears. Shui took a few deep breaths before he managed to regain his composure. He felt like he was standing on solid ground. When he thought back to the dangerous scene just now, he was very flustered. He had almost thought that he was going to die. "I'm fine. Time is of the essence, let's leave as soon as possible." Shui raised a hand and wiped his face heavily. He accidentally pressed down on the bruises on his face, and the pain made him suck in a cold breath. "This general has offended you." A certain general helped Shui onto his warhorse. After he was seated properly, he flipped himself onto the horse. He grabbed the reins and lashed out with his whip. The fleeing group that had stopped set off once again. Everyone's hearts were in their throats. They didn't dare to stop. Even so, they had still been discovered by the enemy. The sound of hooves behind them was getting closer. The two sides were in hot pursuit, and the distance between them was very close. When the sound of hooves entered in Chui's ears, it didn't sound like they were stepping on the ground, but more like they were stepping on his heart to hasten his death. Chase them, they're right ahead. Hiya! The hooves of the horses stomped on the ground, causing the sand on the ground to tremble slightly as if an earthquake had occurred. This scene reminded Chui of his great escape experience in the past. At that time, he had also been riding on a horse that he had stolen. He had whipped the horse with all his might in an attempt to shake off the southern barbarian soldiers who were chasing after him. He had been chased so hard that he couldn't breathe. He didn't have the energy to recall the tragic deaths of his parents, wives, concubines, and children. There was only one thought left in his mind: escape, survive, and take revenge. In the end, he had been shot 3 times in the back by the enemy. While unconscious, he had jumped into the fast-flowing river and luckily escaped with his life. When the ice-cold river water had submerged his head, his brocade clothes had absorbed all the water, and his exhausted body had flowed along with the river water. He had thought that he was dead for sure. After experiencing a long period of darkness, he had woken up despite his tenacity. Dragging his body full of injuries, he had tried his best to leave Nanchang. In the first half of his life, Chui had been a nobleman who had enjoyed a life of luxury. He had never had to do any chores. However, during the few years he had been on the run, Chui had suffered countless hardships and had struggled on the edge of life and death several times. Every time, he had wanted to give up, but the nightmares would always remind him of the tragic deaths of his wife, children, and parents, stirring up the indignation and hatred in his heart. In the end, he had gone into exile in Dongqing. Many years had passed. Chui had thought that the most difficult days were far away from him. He hadn't expected that he would have the chance to relive them today. Back then, he had been fortunate enough to survive. In the end, he had made a comeback and destroyed the southern barbarians to take revenge. If he could escape today, he might be able to create another miracle. Chui harbored such thoughts. His silent eyes seemed to be burning with 2 clusters of flames. Whether it was Lu Zheng who had betrayed him, Jiang Pengji who had stopped him, or Hua Yuan who had secretly disobeyed him, Chui was immersed in his own emotions when he suddenly heard the voice of the general under the tent. It was just a few words, but they were like the sounds of nature. "My lord, we've shaken off our pursuers." "That's great." Chapter 1685. Jiang Pengji had discovered Chui's existence a long time ago. Just as she had expected, the other party had chosen her direction in a panic when they were escaping. Everything was as perfect as he had planned. "My lord, the front line has already started fighting. Should I send troops to support the generals?" The general who spoke used to be Yang Tao's subordinate. Of course, he was now Jiang Pengji's man. Currently, he was mainly responsible for protecting Jiang Pengji. To put it bluntly, he was the leader of the security team. Combat was secondary. Although this position was not very close to the battlefield, it was related to Jiang Pengji's safety. Only her trusted subordinates could take up the post. Sitting in this position not only meant that he had Jiang Pengji's trust, but it also meant that he could make his presence felt in front of the new master. His future was bright. Regarding Jiang Pengji's trust and importance, not only was this person extremely touched, but the old officials of Yang Tao also completely submitted to her and no longer had any suspicions. After all, if Jiang Pengji was really suspicious of Yang Tao's old officials, she would not entrust her own safety to Yang Tao's faction. This was an analysis from an outsider's point of view. Only Jiang Pengji and the audience in the streaming room knew the truth. Her battle prowess was too tyrannical, and most of the guards were just decorations, completely useless. It didn't matter who sat in this position. If promoting the old officials of Yang Tao's faction could make the internal affairs more harmonious, Jiang Pengji didn't mind making them feel touched for a while longer. No need. Let them fight. We have a more important mission. Jiang Pengji spat out the dog's tail grass in her mouth and mounted the horse. She said sternly, "Gather the troops and follow me. I'm afraid there's a big fish today. I'm counting on him for supper tonight." The big fish Jiang Pengji was referring to was naturally in Shui. She was the lord, and the people around her had to listen to her. They would go wherever she wanted them to go. The captain of the security team obeyed the order and went to gather the troops. After a while, he came back with some excitement in his eyes. He had long heard of how powerful this lord was. She was the chosen one, so following her would definitely not go wrong. The dark night posed no obstacle to Jiang Pengji. Her spirit was firmly locked onto An Shui. She calculated his route of advance and arrived at his destination early, waiting for him to walk right into her trap. The terrain here was relatively flat, and there was a shallow pool not far away, so there were mosquitoes everywhere. "Your Highness, we are here to..." The captain of the security team hesitated. There were so many mosquitoes here. Were they here to feed the mosquitoes? Even though he was wearing a mighty and heavy armor with thick clothes underneath, he still couldn't stop those little fellows from invading his body. Not long after, he felt the back of his hand itch a little. He swatted at the mosquitoes with his other hand and killed 3 of them at once. The leader of the security team grimaced, but he did not dare to spit at Jiang Pengji. He did not want to provoke her. He couldn't help but mutter. His lord was dressed tightly, but her skin was soft and tender. Those mosquitoes should like her more, right? Squatting in such a place, he was actually able to maintain his composure and straighten his back. As expected of someone with firm confidence. Little did they know that no mosquito dared to bite Jiang Pengji. She had been fishing for more than 10 years and had not caught a single mosquito. It could be seen how afraid the animals were of her. Which mosquito would dare to bite her? According to salted fish in the streaming room, Jiang Pengji's blood was as poisonous as her person. They're almost here. Jiang Pengji placed her left hand on the hilt of the god-slaying saber at her waist. What's coming? Just as the leader of the security team finished speaking, he faintly felt the ground tremble slightly. He listened attentively and seemed to hear the vague sound of hooves. Very soon, he knew what was coming. The sound of hundreds of hooves was getting closer and closer. The leader of the security team was so shocked that he could not close his mouth. Because they were prepared, and Jiang Pengji used the reeds on the beach as cover, the enemy did not notice them at all. If she had not ordered the archers to attack first and reap a wave of heads, An Shui and the others would probably only realize that something was wrong when they were face to face with Jiang Pengji. The rain of arrows in front of them caught them off guard. The cavalrymen at the front fell off their horses one after another. They only had time to let out a short scream. Isn't it a pleasure to have a friend come from afar? Jiang Pengji drew out the god-slaying saber at her waist. The snow-white blade was extremely eye-catching in the dark night. It was as if the blade did not reflect the moonlight but glowed on its own. Duo Shi, we haven't seen each other for many years. Do you still remember me? It's not easy to meet an old friend. Duo Shi, why don't you stay for a cup of tea and catch up? Why are you in such a hurry? Even though she was speaking ingratiatingly, the murderous intent emanating from her body was so obvious that even a blind man could sense it. Jiang Pengji's voice was not too loud. She was also a distance away from An Shui. Logically speaking, the latter should not have been able to hear her. In the end, not only did An Shui hear her clearly, but the defeated soldiers around him also heard her clearly. Everyone had different reactions, but there was one thing that they all had a common understanding of: terror. And Shui's breathing was heavy. The joy of escaping had not even passed when the soul-reaping envoy followed closely behind and blocked the way out. He used a hoarse and venomous voice, almost squeezing Jiang Pengji's name out of his molars. Lu, Shi, and Shui was like an angry and heavily injured beast. He paced back and forth in his cage anxiously, his eyes filled with murderous intent. As Shui shouted these two words, the soldiers who heard the commotion panicked. Lu Shi, this name had been with them since the beginning of the war like a shadow. They could not help but feel a headache when they heard it, let alone when they saw him in person. Jiang Pengji smiled and said, "Duo Shi, you still remember me." And Shui's breathing became even heavier. How could he not remember? Could it be that today was the day of his death? Would this be his burial ground? No. He would not die, and he would not lose either. And Shui took a deep breath and said, "Lu Shi, you guard your Dongqing, and I'll guard my Nansheng. We'll mind our own business. If there are foreign enemies in the future, we can still help each other. Why must you be so ruthless? Nansheng is not as simple as you think. In the end, I'm afraid the losses outweigh the gains." As he spoke, Shui gave the general beside him a look. The general understood and retreated a little on his horse, hiding behind the people. He held his bow and knocked an arrow, closed his eyes, and determined Jiang Pengji's position based on the sound. This person was a famous archer in Shui's tent. Determining the location of a target by listening to the sound was his specialty. The night was dark, and the distance between them was a little far. If he drew his bow and shot an arrow, it would be extremely difficult for the enemy to discover him. Jiang Pengji could not help but be amused. The two families had fought to this point and would not rest until one side was dead. Did Shui think he could persuade her with just a few words? "What do you mean by, I guard my Dongqing, and you guard your Nansheng?" Jiang Pengji said strangely, "Dongqing is mine, but Nansheng is not yours. My ambition is to rule the world, and Nansheng will be mine in the end. On account of our friendship in the past, I can point out a bright path for you. And Duo Shi, if you lead your troops and pledge allegiance to me, I'll confer you the title of Duke Anil. You'll enjoy a lifetime of glory, splendor, and wealth." As soon as he finished speaking, the archer had already shot an arrow from the dark. The bowstring buzzed softly, and the arrow pierced through the air. And Shui's heart leaped into his throat. Chapter 1686. My leg. The sudden pain made Shui cry out in pain. The warhorse he was riding neighed loudly because of it. Sometimes it raised its front hooves, and sometimes it kicked its hind legs. The more violently it moved, the deeper the arrow had buried in the horse's body, tearing and stirring its flesh. Fresh blood flowed from the wound. The warhorse was startled and jumped around. The person on the horse suffered even more. And Shui was even more unlucky. He was thrown off the horse for the second time. If someone hadn't grabbed his collar when he fell off the horse, he would have suffered a concussion. Of course, Shui's center of gravity wasn't on the warhorse. The pain in his thigh was even more acute, occupying all of his attention. Shui's entire face was contorted in pain. It looked hideous and terrifying. To reduce the pain, he raised his hand and grabbed the cloth around the wound on his thigh. He used so much strength that he almost tore the cloth into pieces. His 5 knuckles were pale from the excessive force. In stark contrast was blood. Warm, sticky blood stained Shui's palm. The red and white contrasted, making the white look whiter and the red look redder. This scene happened in an instant. Before many people could react, Shui had already fallen to the ground, howling in pain. Thus, someone reprimanded him sternly, "Lu Shi, you're a feudal lord. You're so sinister and cunning. How dare you stab someone in the back? Jiang Pengji laughed coldly. She was becoming more and more aloof, but the salted fish in the streaming room couldn't tolerate it. Was their streamer someone who could be slandered by any trash? Kuang Xia Mo sure, a thief calling a thief is probably this kind of person. 5 million salted fish have seen it. How can you distort the truth? Dong Dong Xia Hua Kai, heh, this kind of trash isn't worth the streamer's saliva to defend. This double standard is really unsightly. At your grave mound jumping disco, the point isn't this double standard trash. The point is that the streamer just caught the arrow in the back with her bare hands and threw it back. One word, the super invincible thunderbolt hottie. 2 words, so handsome that I can't close my legs. Pooh Cece, it's a godlike maneuver. I was worried for the streamer just now. I didn't expect her to throw a slap back at me. Our spicy streamer is handsome to a new height every time. That scene just now was so noble and cool that he had no friends. Lo Siji Lianmeng, a straightforward person doesn't beat around the bush. I want to be ked by the streamer until my legs turn to jelly. Number by, pft, I didn't expect you to be so experienced. Tudu Faccio, I didn't expect you to be such a big boss. Count me in. In this era where men were becoming more and more exquisite and young ladies were becoming more and more majestic, Jiang Pengji was simply the lover of the masses. The host's arms were the harbor where they could fight for their entire lives. Not only did this scene cause Shui and the others to be in a frenzy and speak indiscriminately, but the leader of the security team beside Jiang Pengji was also so angry that his eyes were about to split open. It was impossible to defend against the enemy's sneak attack. Even though it wasn't aimed at Jiang Pengji's face, it was still dangerous to aim at her. If she was shot, she would be seriously injured even if she didn't die. They were heartless and unjust, launching a sneak attack first, and now they actually had the cheek to make a false accusation. And Shui had purposely conversed with his lord to attract everyone's attention, then secretly shot an arrow. Was this a gentleman? Bullsh *T about your ancestors. The leader of the security team was a middle-aged man in his 30s who was nearing his 40s. When he scolded, his voice was like rolling thunder. He had cultivated his body and mind for many years. Now that he had failed, he wished he could roll up his sleeves and chop up his enemies to feed to the dogs. You are despicable and shameless. I feel so ashamed on behalf of you sons of bitches. Jiang Pengji couldn't help but roll her eyes. She said softly with a smile, if you want to scold others, just scold them. Why do you have to scold yourselves? He called them sons of bitches and called himself but wasn't the father of a son of a bitch also a tortoise? The leader of the security team was speechless. Don't argue with him at a time like this. Whose side are you on, my lord? Why waste your breath? Tie them up and beat them however you want. I want to see if they have any other part of their bodies that's hard except for their mouths, Jiang Pengji said with a cold smile. That body of worthless bones? Maybe it's not as durable as that thing under their abdomen. The leader of the security team cupped his fists and said, yes, my lord. And Shui's thigh had been pierced by an arrow, and he had been thrown off his horse. He was in so much pain that he almost lost consciousness. Everyone wanted to escape with such a burden, but they couldn't keep up with Jiang Pengji's fast horse. They were all captured after a few moments of struggling. It was a one-sided battle that had no suspense. Jiang Pengji looked down at Shui, who was tied up and had cold sweat dripping from his forehead. She said coldly, back then, I was able to save you from the snow-covered land. Now, I can take your life here. I gave you a way out just now, but you didn't take it. You just want to die. Why? Shui was in so much pain that his lips turned white. Not to mention moving his injured thigh, even breathing would affect his wound. With difficulty, he revealed a mocking smile and said, Lu Lanting, why do you need to pretend to be benevolent and righteous? No matter how I pretend to be benevolent and righteous, didn't I let you drag out an ignoble existence for so many years? You should be deeply grateful. Jiang Pengji raised her foot and used the tip of her shoe to grind against the area near his wound. And Shui screamed in pain again, but she lectured him expressionlessly, a drop of water should be repaid with a spring of water. And Duoshi, this is called repaying a cold arrow. Humph, whether it's a blessing or a curse, you have to bear it yourself. When the captured minister of Anshui saw how Jiang Pengji had humiliated him, he was so angry that smoke almost came out of his head. All sorts of expletives came out of his mouth. Jiang Pengji admired these people with backbone, so she gave them a quick death by beheading them with a single slash of her sword. Many people were so shocked that they shut their mouths when they saw the man who had been cursing and swearing a second ago roll his head on the ground the next second. Winner takes all. Why don't you just accept your fate and admit defeat? You win fair and square, and you lose fair and square. Only the incompetent will bark like crazy. Jiang Pengji didn't even look at the man, but the effect was outstanding. Only those who were observant noticed that the man Jiang Pengji had just beheaded was the man who had secretly shot an arrow at Anshui. Such a streamer had no soul if she didn't take revenge. Anshui endured the excruciating pain and said, "Lu Shi, you want me to admit defeat? Why don't you just kill me?" Jiang Pengji took the handkerchief from the leader of the security team and slowly wiped the blood off the blade of the god-slaying sword. You're stubborn and unwilling to admit defeat, so I naturally won't spare you. But you're a feudal lord after all. Isn't it a waste of your talent to die here? No matter what, I have to make proper preparations and send you on your way with a bang, shouldn't I? Jiang Pengji sheathed the god-slaying sword. Everyone had personally witnessed Jiang Pengji's eloquence. She could make people want to die at any moment. Tie them all up and reward them according to their contributions when we return. The leader of the security team beamed with joy and said in a loud voice, "Yes, sir." Chapter 1687. My lord, someone's coming. The leader of the security team tensed up and ordered the soldiers to be on standby. Just as they finished packing Anshui and the others up, they noticed a group of people rushing towards them. The leader of the security team was worried that it was Anshui's reinforcements. They didn't have many men on their side. If they really fought, they would easily be at a disadvantage. However, Jiang Pengji wasn't worried, because this group of people was none other than the pursuing troops that Anshui and the others had shaken off not long ago. Fu Wang had just met up with them. When Fu Wang heard that General Chui had lost Anshui, he was furious. He wanted nothing more than to capture them and beat them up to vent his anger. It was infuriating to lose such an important, fat fish. Fortunately, the enemy had fled in such a hurry that there was no time to erase any clues. They could follow the traces all the way. Halfway through the chase, the vanguard discovered that someone was blocking the road ahead. He immediately reported to Fu Wang, "General Fu, there are people ahead, but it doesn't seem like an ambush." When Fu Wang heard this, he raised his hand to tighten the reins. He sighed, and the well-trained warhorse quickly came to a halt. "Doesn't seem like an ambush? Go and ask them which battalion they are from." There were tens of millions of people participating in the battle. Although the troops of the various battalions were in contact, the battlefield was chaotic and news traveled slowly. Fu Wang couldn't know every place and every person's movements. If the people ahead were not in Shui, then they were other troops in the army. It was late at night, and it wasn't convenient for them to use battle flags to distinguish between friend and foe. It was better to understand the situation before deciding on their next move. Perhaps Xie Zhe had also discovered Anshui's deserter and had specially sent people to capture him. When the vanguard received Fu Wang's order, he rode forward and asked loudly, "I am General Fu Wang's subordinate. Who are you waiting for?" When the leader of the security team heard this, his tense nerves relaxed, and a hint of joy appeared on his face. "My lord, so it's General Fu Wang's men." Jiang Pengji didn't smile. Instead, she revealed a trace of embarrassment. She seemed to have accidentally stolen Fu Wang's victory, causing the credit to fly away from his hands. "Go and tell him that I'm here." "Yes, my lord." The leader of the security team hadn't realized that he had stolen the victory. "General Fu Wang is here. Hurry and pay your respects." The leader of the security team was in charge of Jiang Pengji's security. Naturally, he would interact with Fu Wang. Both of them were familiar with each other's voices. Hearing this voice, Fu Wang knew that the person in front of him was his lord. Half of his worried heart was relieved. The other half was naturally in Shui, whose whereabouts were unknown. If the lord knew that he had lost track of the enemy's leader, not to mention a reward, it would be good enough if he didn't suffer. Fu Wang braced himself and led his men forward. He dismounted from his horse when he was still 2 to 3 feet away from Jiang Pengji and walked forward. Both sides lit up their torches. With the light dispelling the darkness, they could finally see each other clearly. "General Fu Wang greets the lord." Fu Wang put away his weapon and bowed. He was a little nervous. Jiang Pengji raised her hand to help him up. Her lips curled into an awkward but polite smile. "No need to be so polite, Zhengtu. Are you here for Shui?" Fu Wang was stunned. He didn't know how his lord knew, but he quickly understood Jiang Pengji's meaning from her expression. "Master, what you did was too unethical." Fu Wang felt wronged. He still wanted to say it out loud. Jiang Pengji coughed softly and said, "The fire in the granary rose to the sky. I was worried, so I brought some people over to take a look, but I met them halfway." The captain of the security team listened silently and silently refuted in his heart. How could it be a spur-of-the-moment thing? They had clearly come prepared, and they had specifically come to stop Shui. Fu Wang could not say anything bad about his lord. If she brought up the matter of him losing Shui, he would not be able to get away with it. Thus, the pitiful Fu Wang could only silently accept the fact that his lord had snatched his kill. He could only hold back his tears of blood. He couldn't vent his anger on his master, but he could vent it on Shui. If it wasn't for the fact that this old fellow was so good at running, Fu Wang would have caught him long ago. Would it have been his lord's turn to snatch his head? "My lord, where's Shui?" Jiang Pengji pointed her thumb behind her and pouted. "He's lying there half dead. I'll take care of him when we get back." Fu Wang said, "Is Shui willing to submit?" If he submitted, Fu Wang would probably be so depressed that he would vomit blood. He did not want to see Shui continue to jump around. Jiang Pengji made sarcastic remarks. Her mouth was as poisonous as ever. "Him? He won't turn back even if he hits a brick wall. He's very arrogant." Fu Wang could tell that his lord did not like Shui either. Unless Shui shamelessly stuck to her, she would not ask him to surrender. "This place is too close to the front lines. To avoid accidental injuries, please allow me to send someone to escort you back to the camp." Jiang Pengji did not reject Fu Wang's suggestion. Anyway, Shui had already been captured. She was not interested in the other small fries. "Okay, let's go back to the camp." Shui had been captured. It was a good opportunity to destroy the enemy's nest in one go. She did not want to miss such a good opportunity. Jiang Pengji captured Shui along with a few key personnel. Her words stirred up 1,000 ripples. Yang Si was so shocked that he almost jumped out of his bed. "Wait. Who did you say you caught?" Yang Si was stunned. Was he dreaming and hadn't woken up yet? The person had no choice but to repeat himself. "The enemy's leader, Shui, has been captured." My lord is waiting in the main tent for the military counselor to go over and discuss it. Yang Si wiped his face hard. All his drowsiness had disappeared. And Shui had been captured. This was too exciting. He had the feeling that he had drunk too much and that everything was over when he woke up from his drunken stupor. Fengzhen and the others had similar thoughts. Almost all of them were dumbfounded. They quickly changed their clothes and hurriedly rushed to the main tent. When Wei Ci heard the news, he was still awake. Not only was he not shocked, but he had a feeling that it had finally come. Please wait for a moment. Rong Ci, tidy up your attire so that you won't be disrespectful in front of others. He washed up and tidied up unhurriedly. His calm eyes carried a vague sense of relief. Ever since he had been reborn, he had known that this day would come sooner or later. When Shui had been defeated and killed, Wei Ci had still been imprisoned. When he saw the light of day again, his old master's corpse had long been speckled and cold. Considering that he had been his lord's subject in his previous life, he should go and see him one last time. Because the tent was located relatively close to the main tent, it was not too late for Wei Ci to wash up and head over. Half of the people in the tent had yet to arrive. After a quarter of an hour, the people arrived one after another. Fu Wang and Xie Zhe, the two heroes who had rendered meritorious service, opened the tent and sat in their seats, their bodies covered in blood. As soon as the two of them sat down, someone bowed to them and congratulated them. They had achieved a great victory in this battle. Military merits would not be able to escape. Xie Zhe turned his head and chatted happily with Li Yun. He looked disheveled, but his eyes were bright. People were in high spirits when faced with happy events. Only Fu Wang smiled bitterly to himself. He had been greatly wronged today. As he was thinking, his lord walked out from behind the screen and sat upright. Everyone could not help but straighten their backs. The meeting began. Those who were distracted, those who were miserly, those who were eating snacks, and those who were laughing and joking all became serious. Chapter 1688. What did they have to say? Of course they wanted Shui to die as soon as possible. The food was already heated. Could there be other changes? The 5 million salted fishes complained about the plot as they ate their melons. They'd finally had a good time after holding back for so long. If Shui didn't die, wouldn't it be the same as eating back the shit they'd painstakingly excreted? If that was the case, there would probably be another batch of salted fishes who'd turn from fans to haters. Carefree hee, I hope Shui dies as soon as possible. Tongtong's girl, there are so many people from all walks of life in the streaming room, but I don't like Shui. Let him die. Xingyue Tianyun, streamer, don't forget what Shui did when he conquered the southern barbarians. Even if the southern barbarians deserve to die, Shui's methods were too despicable. If you keep this guy around, he'll bite you when you let your guard down sooner or later. Xiao Wangyang, like. Shui is a ticking time bomb. He can't compare to Huang Song and Yang Tao. If Shui can live even after surrendering, then I'll feel wronged for Su Bei and Su Fei. They're much more likable than Shui. Even though the Su brothers committed suicide after their defeat and didn't die directly at Jiang Pengji's hands, they were still better off than Shui. If someone like Shui could live, the two brothers would be filled with regret if they found out. The salted fishes had a unified opinion, the streamer could go wild, but Shui had to die. Jiang Pengji didn't give any explanation to the salted fishes' discussions. Instead, she paid close attention to the reactions of the civil and military officials. Yang Tao was a straightforward person. He was about to speak when his friend secretly pulled on his sleeve. He was about to stand up. What's wrong, Xiaoyang? Yang Tao asked his friend with his eyes, but the other gave him a shut up look. Anyone can speak up about this matter, except for you. Don't interfere. just be a listener. Yan Lin had been woken up in the middle of the night for a meeting, but his mind was as clear as ever. He could see the situation clearly. Why? Taking advantage of the distance, Yang Tao lowered his voice and talked to his friend. He had to get to the bottom of it. Yan Lin said confidently, the Duke of Lanting has no intention of letting An Shui live. It's impossible to recruit him. It's not the right time for you to go up there and say anything. Yang Tao was also a vassal who had surrendered. Even if he had no intention of stirring up trouble now, a superior would always be on his guard. If Jiang Pengji managed to get them to surrender every time she fought, she would definitely treat the feudal vassals well in order to show her benevolence in the future when the world was settled. Not only did he have to be treated extremely well, but he also had to be given a certain title, such as a king with a different surname. It would be fine if they kept to themselves, but as time went on, this group of people would secretly join forces to cause trouble. Jiang Pengji was not stupid. Why would she leave so many hidden dangers for herself? Huang Song had been summoned to surrender, and he had signed an oath of alliance to restrain him. Yang Tao had been summoned to surrender, and he had been given an important position as an exception. Then what should he do with An Shui, who had been summoned to surrender? This was one of the reasons. The other reason was that Jiang Pengji had been at war for the past few years. She had lost a lot of manpower and resources in order to conquer Nancheng. Even if it was for the sake of the soldiers who had died in the war, Jiang Pengji could not simply summon another feudal lord to surrender. According to Yan Lin's analysis, Jiang Pengji wanted to kill An Shui no matter how he looked at it. Yang Tao was confused. If that's the case, then what's the point of asking? Digging someone out of his bed in the middle of the night just to ask a fill-in-the-blank question with a fixed answer. That was insane. When Yang Tao asked the question, he vaguely felt someone's gaze on him. He looked up and saw that no one was paying attention to him. Yan Lin said, "It's a routine question. It's true that she wants to kill An Shui, but to show that she's not an arbitrary person, she should at least ask." Yang Tao was so shocked that his mouth opened slightly. After a while, he managed to choke out a sentence. It's a pity that I'm only halfway through my dream." Yan Lin was speechless. Because An Shui was more valuable dead than alive, a few important ministers secretly wanted An Shui dead. Of course, not all of Jiang Pengji's subordinates were smart. There were always different opinions. From a short-term perspective, they all agreed that An Shui should not be killed and that they should try to recruit him again. Given that their lord was a little fierce, they were very tactful when they made their suggestions, afraid that they would step on a mine. Jiang Pengji did not comment on this suggestion. She just turned her gaze to the others. "Besides that, do you have any other opinions?" Her gaze swept across Feng Zhen and the others one by one. Yang Si nodded his head, his eyelids drooping. His upper and lower eyelids bumped into each other. Feng Zhen covered half of his face with a fan. It looked normal, but according to the changes in his facial muscles, he was most likely yawning. Li Yun, Xie Zhe, Qi Kuang, and the others looked thoughtful. Unfortunately, they hesitated and did not dare to speak. Wei Ci, Jiang Pengji gave Wei Ci a look. The latter looked slightly awkward, but in the end, he took the initiative to leave the table. "My lord, I don't agree with the judgment of the others." Since the lord had spoken, Wei Ci naturally had to help her and smooth out the show. "Oh? What do you mean? An Shui is only a captive. My lord has personally asked for him to surrender once. How can you ask for him 3 or 4 times? Asking for him once was already giving him face. Don't be so shameless." Wei Ci continued, "Secondly, this person's temperament is treacherous. He acts ruthlessly and ruthlessly. He will do anything to achieve his goals. This can be seen from how he treats the old, weak, women, children, and sick among the southern barbarian captives. If such a cruel and cold-blooded person is recruited to surrender, there is a high possibility that he will betray us in the future. My lord should not take this risk. My lord, please reconsider and consider it carefully. Wei Ci threw out a brick to attract Jade. He explained most of the reasons. Under Jiang Pengji's murderous gaze, Feng Zhen and the others could not continue to slack off. I really think that Zixiao is right. Feng Zhen stood up and added, according to the previous judgment, my lord can indeed take over all of Anshui's remaining troops by asking him to surrender. However, Anshui's troops have long run out of food. Our army will only need to besiege them for a few more days to starve most of them to death. It will be effortless. Since it will take a few more days to make them surrender obediently, why would my lord need to specially ask for Anshui's surrender? I agree with Zixiao and Zisher's deduction. Yang Si followed up with a violent attack. There are still 300,000 to 500,000 troops under Anshui's command at the front line and at the rear. If Anshui is still alive, my lord will not be able to use these troops in the short term. The disadvantages outweigh the advantages. Therefore, my lord, you understand. The steps have been set up. You should quickly go down. After the meeting, everyone should go back early to catch up on their sleep. After Yang Si finished speaking, a few more people spoke up. The voices in favor of killing Anshui were overwhelming. If that's the case, we'll do as everyone says. Jiang Pengji seemed to have made up her mind about something. She said, tomorrow, we'll send out troops and kill him as a sacrifice. Alright, the meeting was coming to an end. The battle plan for tomorrow had been confirmed. Chapter 1689. That was true, but there weren't many who were in the mood to sleep after they returned. The battle the next day was crucial. It was a good opportunity for everyone to fight for credit and gain experience. No one wanted to miss it. Just thinking about it made him excited. How could he fall asleep? Not only could they not sleep, but the captives Anshui and the others could not sleep either. They were anxious about their future. All of them looked dejected, like stray dogs. How does Lu Shi plan to deal with us tomorrow? Everyone had the same thought in their minds. No one wanted to die, but the butcher's knife was in the hands of the enemy. There was nothing they could do. What are you afraid of? At most, we'll die. Why should a man be afraid of death? A burly man with a bad temper said stubbornly, I've heard that Lu Shi has killed countless people and is ruthless. If we don't surrender, we'll most likely die. If we surrender, we'll have to be subservient to this person for the rest of our lives. It's better to die than to be humiliated like this. If you're greedy for life and afraid of death, then surrender. When everyone heard this, their faces turned ashen. They didn't know if they were frightened by the burly man's words or angered by them. Someone said, is Lu Shi really so overbearing? If you don't surrender, you can just return to your hometown. Why do you want to kill people to vent your anger? Although it was normal to kill captives, not every captive could be killed. Scribes had certain privileges in this regard. At most, they could live in seclusion. They didn't have to sacrifice their lives. Of course, even though they said that, these people who were once in high positions of power and played with the wind and clouds couldn't be content with peace. The choices in front of them were really limited. They had to worry about their heads. In fact, many of them already had the idea of surrendering. It didn't matter which boss they worked for. Whoever gave them money, power, and status would be their bread and butter. If Anshui was defeated, they would jump ship. This was normal. However, these words were too embarrassing to say. Whoever said it first would seem like the one who was fickle, and a vile person without loyalty. In particular, the burly man spoke heroically. Whoever mentioned surrendering to Jiang Pengji would be the first to stand out. To prevent the atmosphere from becoming too awkward, someone cleverly changed the topic. Our lives and deaths are still a small matter, but the Lord's situation is really not good. If they submitted, they would have a chance to climb up in the future. Didn't they see that Huang Song and Yang Tao's former officials were still enjoying themselves in Jiang Pengji's tent? If An Chui pledged allegiance to Jiang Pengji, the outcome would be different. In the future, he would be conferred the title of Marquis to appease them. He would have no real power in his hands and no more than 3 to 5 followers. He could only be an animal in Jiang Pengji's pen for the rest of his life, constantly worrying about his own life. Who would be willing to live such a life if they had a bit of dignity? An Chui had once been an all-powerful duke, so he could not tolerate such a great disparity. Master. Sigh, we can only blame ourselves for being useless and unable to protect Master. Everyone sighed and groaned, trying to push the blame onto themselves. It was as if An Chui's current predicament was their fault. No matter how affectionate their words were, it was useless. These words would not bring any substantial harm to them. Instead, it would deepen their image of loyalty and righteousness, so why not? They were no fools. They had a vague idea of what had happened to An Chui. An Chui probably wouldn't be able to escape this calamity. Even so, they hadn't expected Jiang Pengji to deal with An Chui by killing him and sacrificing him to the flag. What was sacrificing to the flag? Before the army set off, they sacrificed living creatures to the gods and prayed for the gods' blessings to achieve victory. Jiang Pengji had always disliked superstition. In the more than 10 years of war, the number of times she sacrificed to the flag was pitifully few. Most of the time, it wasn't to pray for blessings to the gods, but to kill the enemy to boost morale. The living creatures she sacrificed to the flag included, but were not limited to, chickens, ducks, fish, geese, pigs, dogs, cows, sheep, enemies, and traitors. For example, during the battle in Changya, the fellows who had jumped between her and Huang Song had been captured by her tricks and killed as a sacrifice to the flag. However, most of these living creatures were small pawns. It was the first time she had encountered a leader like An Chui. On the second day, the army gathered neatly. The half-dead An Chui was carried to the altar. Upon seeing this, An Chui understood his fate. He was so angry that his face darkened. Lu Shi, how dare you humiliate me like this? Killing a duke to sacrifice to the flag. Weren't you afraid that this display would cause dissatisfaction among the scholars of the world? Jiang Pengji pressed her left hand on the hilt of her sword. With a cold expression, she said, "How can this be called humiliating? You're unwilling to pledge allegiance to me, but I can't possibly release you as a commoner. Isn't this your fate of choice? How can you blame me?" Jiang Pengji's counterattack last night had been merciless. Even though the arrow hadn't hurt An Chui's thigh artery, it had made him wish he were dead. Later, when the medics pulled out the arrow to stop the bleeding, he fainted from the pain. After a round of torment, he had lost half his life. Now that he had been captured and brought to the altar as a sacrifice, An Chui's spirit became more and more dispirited. His angry questioning just now was more like the final radiance of a setting sun. No matter how angry An Chui was, he couldn't change the fate of the loser. Someone had gagged his mouth with a dirty handkerchief, and he was forced to kneel on the ground. With the posture of a sinner, he showed his sorry state to the thousands of soldiers below him. His opponent, Jiang Pengji, accepted everyone's worship and submission to her as a ruler. An Chui's hands were tied behind his back with hemp rope. His shoulders were suppressed by 2 burly men on his left and right. His head, which was usually held high, had no choice but to hang down. No matter how he struggled, he couldn't move an inch. Apart from causing the wound on his thigh to open up and blood to flow, he didn't gain anything else. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps an hour, perhaps only half a cup of tea's time, a blinding white light flashed before his eyes. And Chui subconsciously shrunk his head. He closed his left eyelid, which had been hit by the white light, and used his right eye to see the source of the white light. It turned out to be the saber at Jiang Pengji's waist. The morning sun rose slowly from the east. Puff! The saber in her hand fell. With a flash of white light, and Chui's head was separated from his corpse. Fresh blood sprayed onto the altar like a pillar, dyeing it scarlet. The soldiers who witnessed this scene let out a tsunami of cheers. The Lu flag fluttered in the wind, forming a sea of red. The army has set out for battle. We wish you all a triumphant return. The general said, "We swear to live up to our mission even if we die." Dozens of people shouted. Their voices reverberated in the drill ground, stirring up waves of hot blood and making one's heart surge. There was no need to elaborate on the outcome of letting a group of jackals, who had been boosted by morale, go on a punitive expedition against a group of stray dogs with low morale and a lack of food and rations. After this battle, Jiang Pengji defeated An Chui's remaining army of more than 200,000 with only 100,000 troops. She achieved a complete victory. The three armies continued south along the river, heading straight for An Chui's lair. 2/3 of Nansheng had fallen into Jiang Pengji's hands. The enemy troops along the way had little power to resist. Chapter 1690. When there was no tiger in the mountain, the monkey was king. This was probably referring to the Xichang emperor concubine. Ever since the young master committed suicide, Huayuan rarely visited the Xichang emperor concubine. No one knew what he was busy with every day, and he was very mysterious. Without Huayuan's interference, the Xichang emperor concubine's days were very comfortable. All the servants in the mansion treated her as their most precious treasure. The old officials would often send their wives over to visit her, and the gifts they gave her were all precious and rare. The days of being worshipped and fawned upon by others was before the fall of Xichang kingdom. The Xichang emperor concubine regained the feeling of being above everyone else and almost forgot all the unhappiness and hardships she had suffered. However, she was soon unable to be happy. The delayed pregnancy almost caused her to lose her form. Nausea and vomiting, dizziness and fatigue, drowsiness and salivation, one symptom after another found her and took up almost all of her energy. When she finally got used to it, her swollen legs and ugly marks on her stomach made her feel disgusted. The first time she felt the movement of the fetus, this disgust reached its peak. Looking at her balloon-like belly, the Xichang emperor concubine would often wake up from nightmares. In her dreams, she would dream that she had given birth to a monster with 3 heads and 6 arms. This monster had 3 eyes, 4 mouths, and each foot only had 2 toes. It could speak the human language the moment it was born. Every time she had nightmares, this monster would use its limbs to burst open her belly and climb out with a hideous smile. It would open its mouth and devour her organs clean. Every time she woke up screaming, she would realize that she was covered in cold sweat and her stomach was in pain. The doctor did not dare to use strong medicine because the fetus in her belly was too precious. He could only use a mild sedative to help her sleep. After a few days of rest, the nightmares and night sweats had clearly weakened. The maid carefully asked for her opinion. "Madam, the weather is very good today. Do you want to take a walk in the courtyard?" The Xichang emperor concubine slept until dawn, which was a rare occurrence. Her irritable mood had greatly improved, and the maid who served her also heaved a sigh of relief. If this continued, they would go crazy before the Xichang emperor concubine gave birth. Emperor concubine Xichang had eaten an exquisite breakfast and was in a good mood. When she looked up and saw the golden sunlight shining down from outside, she was instantly excited. With one hand on her waist and the other on her round belly, she walked slowly with the help of her maid. As her body was too heavy, Xichang's empress concubine felt tired after walking one round. She returned to the house and leaned lazily against the table. In order to pass the time, Xichang's Empress concubine deliberately looked for a maidservant to chat. Is there anything new out there recently? The maid thought about it carefully and said, I didn't hear anything special. What about Counselor Hua? The Xichang Empress concubine probably felt that her question was too straightforward, so she pretended to hide it and explained, he is, after all, the most valued minister of the old master. The old master is fighting on the front lines, and the matters in the rear, including the mother and son, are entrusted to him. That is why I asked this question. I don't know why, but I've been so flustered these past few days. I've been having nightmares about terrible things in the middle of the night. Of course, Xichang's Empress concubine would not say that she had dreamed of giving birth to a monster. Instead, she said that she had a nightmare because she was too worried about Shui. The maid did not suspect anything. She said, Counselor Hua. I've heard a little about it. I've heard that Counselor Hua hasn't been himself lately. Xichang's Empress concubine's eyebrows twitched. What's not himself? Usually, military Counselor Hua was gentle and courteous. However, after the young lord passed away, he seemed to have changed into a different person. Not only was he irritable, he even whipped the servants who made mistakes to death. The maid, who did not know the inside story, could not help but sigh. That's true. Counselor Hua has been young master's disciple for many years. If the young master commits a mistake and is trying to escape punishment, Counselor Hua will definitely be affected. The maid was straightforward and almost said that the young master had committed suicide to escape punishment. This was a taboo that everyone kept to themselves. If she said the wrong thing, she would lose her life. Fortunately, she stopped in time, and Xichang's Empress concubine did not blame her for speaking out of turn. That was how she managed to keep her life. Xichang's Empress concubine revealed a hint of mockery. Shui's adopted young master had died at Hua Yuan's hands. It was good enough that he did not wake up laughing in the middle of the night. How could he be sad? As for the maids, easily angered, and whipping, these changes were not a huge change in temperament in Xichang's Empress concubine's eyes. It was clear that Hua Yuan had revealed his true nature. He was finally willing to tear off the mask of a gentleman that he had maintained for so many years and return to his true self. Apart from that, is there nothing else? Xichang's Empress concubine stroked her belly from time to time. She felt sleepy. The gossipy maid revealed a troubled expression. Xichang's Empress concubine caught it and said, if there's anything, just say it. Don't beat around the bush and be secretive. It's better if you say it now. It's better than if I somehow hear it in the future and alarm the little ancestor in my belly. The maid gritted her teeth and said, Madam, I heard some bad news 2 days ago. It said that the situation at the front lines is not good. Xichang's Empress concubine's heart tightened as she asked, not good? How is it not good? How would I know? I only heard it from a martial artist with some connections. I'm not too sure about the specifics. After the maid finished speaking, she pleaded, Madam, these things cannot be spread. If the head nanny finds out, I'll lose my life. Xichang's Empress concubine replied casually, I know. I won't tell anyone. She thought that the situation at the front lines was not good. That was also within Hua Yuan's plans, so she was not worried at all. Who would have thought that Hua Yuan was already a complete lunatic? Others could not predict his next move at all. His operations were a mystery. When the news that Shui had been killed by Jiang Pengji as a sacrifice came back, Xichang's Empress concubine was still dumbfounded. Who did you say died? Xichang's Empress concubine held her belly with one hand with difficulty. She grabbed the maid's hand with the other, her long fingernails digging into the maid's flesh. The maid's expression was hideous from the pain, but she did not dare to scream or shake off Xichang's Empress concubine's hand. She could only grit her teeth and hold on. The messenger paused, and his voice could not help but lower. Our lord is dead. Dead? And Shui was dead? Even though Xichang's Empress concubine was already mentally prepared, she was still shocked when she heard the news. No matter how bad An Shui was, he was Xichang's Empress concubine's greatest support at the moment. Her support had suddenly fallen. She was a sensitive and thoughtful pregnant woman, so her state of mind was naturally different from that of a normal person. How did he die? The messenger did not seem to want to answer this question, but he had no choice but to. After all, An Shui's death was too humiliating for a noble. Chapter 1691. But no matter how vague it was, it could not change reality. 2/3 of Nanjing had fallen into the hands of the enemy, leaving her and her child with only 1/3 of the territory and the barren land of the southern barbarians. Now, they had to face the pressure of the enemy. It was hard to say if they could keep this bit of territory. 2/3 of Nanjing was in the hands of the enemy, leaving her and her child with only 1/3 of the territory and the barren land of the southern barbarians. The current situation was set up by that bastard Hua Yuan. He should have a backup plan, right? The Xichang Emperor's concubine felt uneasy. She had sacrificed everything in exchange for a few short months of peace. She did not want to go back to her days of wandering. As the Emperor's concubine, she was born into a noble family. How could she live a life worse than that of a commoner? An Shui was dead. The only person she could rely on was Hua Yuan. Little did she know that the outside world was also in a mess. The complexity of the situation was not something a woman trapped in the inner courtyard like her could imagine. In order to eliminate dissidents, Hua Yuan had secretly forced many people to die. These people had discovered the abnormality of the rations, but could not find the culprit. As a result, they alerted the enemy and ended up on Hua Yuan's death list. No one knew that Hua Yuan's personality had changed greatly recently. He was not just irritable and easily whipped to death servants who made mistakes. On the day the young master committed suicide, Hua Yuan's main personality was awake for a short period of time, but it was quickly suppressed by the split, Lu Shi. From then on, the frequency of the main personality's awakening increased, but it was still very short, so short that it was not enough for the main personality to commit suicide. When the secondary personality realized this, he began to doubt himself uncontrollably, causing his condition to worsen. In the end, he even had auditory, visual, smell, taste, and touch hallucinations. It was so severe that he could not distinguish reality from hallucinations. Sometimes he laughed excitedly, sometimes he was irritable, sometimes he was sad, sometimes he was anxious and depressed. Even his dream of hegemony lost its motivation. It was as if there was a voice in his heart telling him over and over again that this world was boring and that fighting for hegemony was useless. He was alone, but he could hear all sorts of noises. There were women calling him, men laughing and scolding by his ear, and the young master who had passed away happily called him teacher in a childish voice. He could still hear An Shui calling his name in a dignified voice in his dreams, and people he didn't know chattered by his ear without end. In a trance, he might see a familiar person waving at him from the end of the road, but when he washed his hands with cold water, he felt like he was being burned. He insisted that the basin of cold water was not cold water, but a basin of charcoal, that there were other people in the room besides him and his attendants, that it was not a sunny day outside, but a storm and lightning. But the attendants who served him looked shocked and frightened, as if he had said something terrible. Hua Yuan insisted that he was right, so the servant who refuted him was naturally wrong. An inexplicable anger dyed his eyes red. When he came back to his senses, the servant was lying on the ground in a bloody mess, without a sound. In his hand, he was holding the whip that had caused his attendant's skin and flesh to split open. The whip was so deep that the bone could be seen. Bright red blood flowed down to his feet. The socks under his feet were full of the attendant's blood, and every step he took left a pair of bloody footprints. Hua Yuan resisted this strange version of himself. He was Lu Shi, the Lu Shi of Hejin County, not a lunatic with a clear mind. The more he denied it, the more frequent the hallucinations became. Once, when he was dealing with government affairs, he suddenly smelled something burning. When he looked up, he saw the red flames engulfing the house. He shouted, "The water is on fire," and hurriedly ran out of the fire, but the people who heard the news said that there was no fire. It was still daytime, and the candles were not lit. It was raining heavily outside, so how could there be a fire? Hua Yuan was stunned, and his face turned pale. He tried to cover up the matter, saying that he was frightened by a nightmare. That night, he dreamed of a person he hadn't thought of for a long time, Lu Zheng. In the dream, he and Lu Zheng were arguing fiercely, replaying the scene of their confrontation that year. Lu Zheng questioned him. His every word was powerful and resonant. "Do you really think you are Lu Shi? You are just a figment of Hua Yuan's imagination after he lost his mind." Hua Yuan was so angry that he wanted to pull out a knife and chop Lu Zheng's mouth. "If you are Lu Shi, why don't you think about your experience since you were young?" Hua Yuan refused to admit it. Although his memory of the past was very blurry, he thought that it was because he woke up in a stranger's body. As long as he took back his body and identity, everything would get better. "You say you are Lu Shi, then do you remember that when I was studying in Langya County, I drank with you at the mountain gazing pavilion? What did you and I talk about in that pavilion?" You can't answer because you are not Lu Shi. You are Hua Yuan, from Nanxing Ningzhou. No. Hua Yuan clenched his molars and silently refuted Lu Zheng's bewitching words. You have parents, older brothers, twin brothers, who died young, parents, passed away due to an epidemic. Your property was taken away by your uncle and aunt. They raised you. You are, weak, and married, a slut. This woman had an affair and gave birth to a son and a daughter. However, the other party was relentless. His voice was like the ubiquitous air and the most vicious curse, firmly occupying Hua Yuan's ears. You are not Lu Shi at all. You are a lunatic who has lost his mind but doesn't know who he is. I am not. Hua Yuan roared as he sat up straight. The sleeping clothes he was wearing were already drenched in sweat, and his long hair seemed to have been scooped out of the water. I am not. I am not. I am not. He grabbed the sword on the shelf and pulled it out with a swoosh. He waved it everywhere as if he had gone mad. The servants on night watch outside heard the commotion and did not dare to enter the room to take a look. When the sun rose the next day, the servant heard the commotion in the room and finally opened the door with trembling hands. Hua Yuan's bedroom had been smashed to pieces, and almost nothing in the room was intact. The servant's heart trembled as he carefully looked for Hua Yuan. In the end, he found the other party in white sleeping clothes walking out of the corner. He was so scared that his eyes almost rolled back. When is it? Hua Yuan looked dispirited and his voice was hoarse. He looked like he had overindulged after taking a few women at night. Seeing that Hua Yuan was still conscious, the servant whispered, "It was just the beginning of the morning." The beginning of the morning? That was still very early. Hua Yuan asked the servant to prepare hot water for him to wash up and change his clothes. After eating breakfast, he went to work. He had not even warmed his seat when he received the news that Enshui had died. Enshui had died. Logically speaking, Enshui was Hua Yuan's imaginary enemy. Hua Yuan should be cheering in his heart even if he did not show any joy on his face. In the end, is there a leak in the room? He looked up. The roof was fine. Chapter 1692. The Lord was dead, and the young lord was gone. Enshui's other relatives had all died in the Nanman disaster. Faced with this situation, everyone wanted to curse in their hearts. Whether it was them or Shui when he was alive, who hadn't privately mocked Jiang Pengji that she was destined to be taken advantage of? Some people even thought maliciously that if Jiang Pengji collapsed in the middle of the road and all her hegemony would end up benefiting others, would she come back to life from anger when she saw this in the netherworld? They used this as evidence to demonstrate the inferiority of female feudal officials, once again confirming that the existence of female feudal officials was unreasonable. In the end, after many years, Jiang Pengji, who still had 0 children, was still alive and kicking, able to fight, write, and smile. What about Shui? Shui was dead, and the heir who was about to come of age was gone. His hegemony was about to end. Oh, that was not right. The Xichang princess still had Shui's posthumous child in her womb, so it could not be considered as the end of the line yet. However, what use could a baby who was not yet born and whose gender was unknown be? Could it be that they should work together to resist foreign enemies and wait for the child to be born before worshipping him as master? From the child's birth to adulthood, it would be a full 20 years. The key was that the child's aptitude was unknown. The late Lord Shui passed away suddenly, and he did not have the chance to appoint a minister to entrust the child to before he died. Hearing this, perhaps someone would ask questions in a good mood. Didn't Shui think highly of Hua Yuan, then Lu Zheng? If he were to choose who to entrust the child to, these two would undoubtedly be the first choice. That being said, if Shui did not personally appoint them, who would be convinced? Even a fool would know that whoever became the minister would temporarily exercise authority on behalf of the Lord. He was not a feudal official, but he was better than a feudal official. If the minister was more ambitious, it was possible to seize power and occupy the late lord's estate. Even if Shui's estate was in a precarious state, it could not stop the greed of people. In the face of a big enough temptation, there would always be people who liked to abandon their brains and choose to think with their bare eyes. With both external and internal troubles, the Xichang princess, who thought she was in a stable position, panicked. Once the news of Shui's death came, the wife of the minister who attended to her every day did not come, as if they had a tacit understanding. Not only that, but the servants who served her were also somewhat neglectful. They were not as careful as before. This gave the Xichang princess an ominous feeling. With a big belly, she visited Hua Yuan in the middle of the night to find a solution. In the end, she didn't see Hua Yuan. Instead, she saw her brother. After Xichang's Empress concubine successfully got pregnant, the siblings reduced their private interactions. Although the royal family often did dirty things, it did not mean that the members of the royal family could accept the siblings without any grudges. The Xichang imperial concubine was rather disgusted by this matter. If not for the sake of survival and long-term considerations, she would not have easily compromised with Hua Yuan. Meeting again after several months, the atmosphere between the brother and sister was a little strange. However, no matter how awkward it was not as important as her own life. Xichang's Empress concubine hurriedly asked her brother. The Prince of Xichang looked much healthier than the last time they met. However, he had not rested well in recent days and looked listless. I'm afraid we've fallen into Hua Yuan's trap. The Prince of Xichang looked at his sister sorrowfully with a heavy sense of exhaustion. Emperor concubine Xichang's heart tightened. A trap? Why? She stared at her brother's mouth, worried that he would say something despairing. We were too naive at the time and underestimated the viciousness of the human heart. That's why we were deceived by Hua Yuan's flowery words, the Prince of Xichang said tiredly. Shui is dead. The young master is dead. Other than the one in your womb, Shui does not have a single bloodline on the surface. Logically speaking, everyone should treat this bloodline as their master and let Hua Yuan be an important minister. Hua Yuan will be able to rightfully control power through you and your child. Although she would be a puppet by doing this, at least she would not have to worry about food and clothing. In the future, when her child grew up, Xichang's Empress concubine could use their mother-son relationship to pull her child to her side. She could work hard to make Hua Yuan a mere figurehead and burn the bridge after crossing it. In the end, she would be able to make a comeback. Xichang's Empress concubine was stunned. She pretended to be calm. Isn't that the case? This plan seems to be going smoothly, but in reality, there are 3 prerequisites. What prerequisites? First, the power that Enshui left behind must be strong enough to last until your son grows up. Xichang's Empress concubine was speechless. With Enshui's death, his power was on the verge of collapse. The enemy would not let go of such a good opportunity to beat him while he was down. Even though she was a woman from the inner courtyard, she knew that this matter was very dangerous. If she continued to struggle, even 2 years would be difficult, much less 20 years. Second, Enshui appointed Hua Yuan as an important minister. Everything is in the open. Xichang's Empress concubine gritted her teeth. But that person is already dead. He left nothing behind. Enshui had died too quickly. Not only had he buried hundreds of thousands of soldiers with him, he had not left behind any arrangements for a successor. No, I still have this. The Empress concubine caressed her belly as if she was clutching at her last straw. The prince asked her, "Who says that Enshui's bloodline will definitely inherit Enshui's legacy?" The Empress concubine was stunned by the question. "You say someone will usurp the throne?" The prince sighed. Since ancient times, there have been many magnanimous dukes who, for the sake of the bigger picture, entrusted their legacy to important ministers. That's how it was recorded in the history books, and it led to a beautiful conversation between ruler and minister. Of course, there are also those who are thick-skinned enough to openly usurp power under the banner of completing the unfinished ambitions of the previous ruler. You and I were too naive before. It's too late to understand now. Top tacticians could understand the details immediately, but the siblings did not have the brains and carelessly fell into Hua Yuan's trap. The Empress concubine's face paled. And third? Third, Enshui's old ministers are loyal enough. They will not harm you and your son for their own selfish desires. This was very difficult. These old ministers were already restless. Although they did not put their selfish desires on the surface, they still gave themselves away. The Xichang prince had thought that the first person to become restless would be Hua Yuan. He had not expected it to be Enshui's other old ministers. These old ministers usually did not have much of a presence, but they were experienced and had outstanding family backgrounds. They belonged to the hidden faction of power. On the other hand, Hua Yuan, this guy had not made a move. It was really illogical. At present, the greatest danger that Xichang's Empress concubine and her son faced was not from Hua Yuan, but from those old ministers who coveted Enshui's legacy. The siblings had thought of things as a matter of course. When the truth was laid out in front of them, they were all dumbfounded. When Xichang's Empress concubine heard this, her delicate body could not help but tremble. She asked him in a sobbing voice. "Royal brother, then what should we do?" The prince was also in despair. "Right now, the only one who can protect us is Hua Yuan, but he," the Empress concubine hurriedly asked, "what happened to him?" "Ever since he lost his student, his mind has not been very clear. He often speaks crazily and whips people at the slightest provocation," the Empress concubine said in shock. "How could this be? That young master was personally plotted against and forced to death by him. Now he's acting crazily. What was he doing earlier?" The prince shook his head. "I don't know." Chapter 1693. Could it be that he wants to play the fool and take advantage of everyone's fight, causing both sides to suffer, and then reap the benefits? Based on Hua Yuan's past behavior, this guess was not without reason. By doing so, he could easily exhaust the siblings to death, and he could borrow the hands of others to eradicate the bloodline in the Empress concubine's womb. In the end, he could stand out at the crucial moment and use the crime of harming the deceased lord's child to get rid of the ambitious competitor. After all these twists and turns, Hua Yuan would still be the winner. If that's the case, then Hua Yuan's schemes are too terrifying. He's included almost everyone. The Empress concubine's guess was not without reason. Even the Xichang prince was convinced by her, but there was one thing he did not understand. But, what benefits does he gain by doing this? The Empress concubine was stunned. She could not understand this question either. If Hua Yuan wanted to seize power, he had other ways to get rid of Anshui and preserve his troops. He would not let Jiang Pengji take advantage of him. In the end, Hua Yuan did not use the best of both worlds method and chose a method that harmed others without benefiting himself. The death of Hua Yuan would also cause the death of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The rear had rations, but not enough troops. How could they defend against the enemy? The enemy they were about to face was not an ordinary small fry. She was a veteran who had dominated the chaotic world for more than a decade. How was Hua Yuan so confident that he could defeat Jiang Pengji with his current forces? After thinking for a long time, the Empress concubine lowered her eyes and said sarcastically, "Forget it. How can normal people like us figure out the thoughts of a madman?" This topic was temporarily put aside. The most important thing now was to protect themselves and not to explore Hua Yuan's thoughts. In reality, the siblings were afraid of being tricked by Hua Yuan. They had subconsciously turned Hua Yuan into an omnipotent figure. How could Hua Yuan not be able to divine something that they all understood? There was a saying that went, "Man proposes, but God disposes." Who could truly predict everything? Hua Yuan's calculations were very thorough, but there were too many variables. The enemy was too strong, Anshui was too smart, and Anshui had misjudged him. All sorts of variables converged together, resulting in this quantitative change that no one could have predicted. The Empress concubine stroked her round belly and sighed. Even if we know we've been tricked by Hua Yuan, what can we do? In the end, we still have to rely on him. This was the most ironic part. On one hand, they hated Hua Yuan, but on the other hand, they had no choice but to attach themselves to him for some security. The Empress concubine lowered her head, and naturally didn't see the prince's complicated expression and the humiliation he was bitterly suppressing. The atmosphere between the brother and sister was strangely stagnant. They looked at each other and tacitly avoided the common wound in their hearts. The prince said, "We were counting on him, but he wanted to abandon us." The Empress concubine wasn't discouraged. "Convince him, and we still have a chance to live. Everything has to be tried to know the result." None of the old officials Anshui had left behind were reliable. When the Empress concubine thought of this, she gnashed her teeth in hatred. Anshui had died not long ago. His corpse hadn't even gotten cold, yet these old officials were already impatiently fighting for power. Not only that, but they also wanted to harm their lord's posthumous child. Such a despicable act was simply unheard of. "I can't see him either. These few days." The Xichang prince shook his head. He suddenly thought of something and said unwillingly, "These 2 days, Hua Yuan's whereabouts are a mystery. He's pretending to be crazy again, and no one is keeping a close eye on him. Who knows where Hua Yuan ran off to? Sometimes he's crazy, and sometimes he's sober. He doesn't even recognize the old servant that has served him for many years. I've tried to visit him several times, but he's been blocked outside." The Xichang prince who lived in Hua Yuan's manor hadn't even seen him, much less the Xichang Empress concubine. The Empress concubine's face was deathly pale. "Is Hua Yuan sincerely avoiding us and refusing to see us?" If Hua Yuan really did close the door and refuse to see them, didn't that mean he was determined to abandon them and watch them die? The prince was hesitant. The Empress concubine said, "Imperial brother, if you have something to say, just say it. At this time, there's no need to avoid it. We can't rely on Huayuan, but there's one person who might be able to help us. At the very least, he can protect you and your mother's lives." When the Empress concubine heard this, her amorous eyes lit up. She hastily asked who it was. The prince spoke of a person the Empress concubine didn't expect. He said, "Lu Zheng, Lu Xiaoyin." This person was originally Shui's most valued strategist in the early days. Later, Huayuan fought with him, and he lost. That's why he lost favor with Shui. Even so, Lu Zheng still has some prestige in Shui's camp. If he's willing to protect the late master and Shui's posthumous son, you and your mother will most likely be able to survive this calamity. The Empress concubine didn't know much about Lu Zheng. She only knew that he existed, but she hadn't had much contact with him. Will that work? The Empress concubine hesitated. She was afraid of jumping out of Huayuan's pit and into another pit. The prince said, "I've asked around in private. Lu Zheng was of humble birth, but his character is respectable. He doesn't have the disdainful flaws of those poor scholars. And Shui treated him so well, yet he never changed his mind and submitted to anyone else. He's clearly a loyal and devoted person. And Shui is already dead. No matter how he disheartened Lu Zheng when he was alive, he's already dead. How could Lu Zheng vent his anger on an innocent posthumous son? If you ask him for help, there's at least a 70% chance that he'll protect you and your mother, if not 100%. The Empress concubine was tempted by his words. However, the Xichang royal siblings would never have guessed that Lu Zheng had already disappeared from their investigations. And Shui's army had been defeated and killed. There had indeed been a small group of defeated soldiers who'd escaped by relying on tree bark and wild vegetables. They'd been starving along the way. Lu Zheng wasn't among this group of people. The Xichang Empress concubine didn't give up. She sent people to inquire again and finally found news of Lu Zheng. 1 or 2 days before Shui's death, Lu Zheng had fallen seriously ill and was sent to a nearby village to recuperate. He'd most likely either died of illness or starvation by now. Her last hope was shattered. In her despair, the Xichang Empress concubine moved the fetus. The doctor diagnosed that there were signs of a miscarriage. In order to protect the only trump card in her belly, she didn't dare to make any more trouble. She lay in bed for several days to recuperate. The Xichang siblings were no longer causing trouble. Huayuan was crazy and didn't care about anything. The other old officials fought for power and negotiated at the same time. Everything was a mess. When Shui's power was at its peak, he wasn't Jiang Pengji's match. Now that he was half dead, he obviously didn't have the ability to resist. Seeing that the war was going smoothly, she handed over the responsibility of the various battlefields to the other generals. She sat in the middle of the army and her days were leisurely. When the days were leisurely, she naturally had more time to do more things. For example, torturing the noobs. It wasn't that she was complaining, but Lu Zheng's chess skills were really bad. Lu Zheng was speechless. First, Wei Xi held his hand to discuss a game, then he was pressed down by Jiang Pengji in front of the chessboard for a friendly exchange. Chapter 1694. Lu Zheng was not the type of person who would sit and wait for death. It was just that he was old now, and his words were not as sharp and straightforward as when he was young. Therefore, he mocked Jiang Pengji for not winning against Shui honorably, saying that it was all because of Shui's incompetent teammates that she could achieve what she had today. Jiang Pengji twirled the chess pieces and thought about her next move so that LV Zheng would lose more rhythmically. I didn't plant a spy around and she thought that LV Zheng was mocking her for using spying to trick Shui. Even though this was a normal battle maneuver, and it wasn't a low-level one, she wouldn't admit that she hadn't done it before. Lu Zheng thought of the annoying Hua Yuan and the even more annoying Lu Shi personality. He sneered and said nothing. "You're the only one I know among Andy's bunch of crooks. You can't be a spy that I sent, and I didn't do such a thing." Jiang Pengji defended herself and ridiculed Lu Zheng at the same time. She continued, "Besides, luck is also a part of one's strength. If he really wants to blame someone, he can only blame An Shui for not being able to see through people and trusting the wrong person. How can he blame me for being too powerful and having a keen eye?" Lu Zheng, sure enough, it was a familiar taste, a familiar venomous tongue, and a familiar narcissism. It's not anyone else. It's Hua Yuan. To prevent Jiang Pengji from continuing to be narcissistic and disgusting, he chose to take the initiative to explain. Jiang Pengji was astonished. She had a very good memory, so she naturally knew who Hua Yuan was. Wasn't he that unlucky guy with schizophrenia? "Xiaoyin, I don't understand what you're saying. I've only met Hua Yuan once. What can I possibly instigate in him?" In the past, Hua Yuan represented An Shui and formed an alliance with Jiang Pengji. They only met once. What could Jiang Pengji do in such a short time? Lu Zheng sighed and said, "Hua Yuan has gone mad. A good counselor turned out to be a lunatic." It really made people sigh. Jiang Pengji vaguely felt that the words sounded familiar. She secretly glanced at Wei Ci. Wei Ci had said something similar to her before. "I know that. I had a feeling when I first met him. His mind was a little abnormal. But so what? He lost his mind and imagined himself to be Lu Shi. He imagined himself to be you, so how could he sincerely assist An Shui?" Jiang Pengji's hand paused. What kind of personality did this lunatic split into? LV Zheng did not understand, so Jiang Pengji changed the way she asked. "I mean, who does Hua Yuan think he is?" LV Zheng didn't say anything. He just silently looked at her. The meaning was clear. After Jiang Pengji recovered from her shock, she quickly accepted the setting. "So what? Without Hua Yuan, I'll be able to take down An Shui within the year," Lu Zheng said faintly. Arrogant and conceited. If Hua Yuan had not interfered, Lu Zheng would have been the one assisting An Shui. Would he allow Jiang Pengji to destroy the An Shui line of defense within a year and conquer the entire territory? Jiang Pengji smiled. "This is called knowing one's limitations. I never exaggerate my abilities." Lu Zheng could not help but roll his eyes. Although Lu Shi's personality had only been online for a short period of time, his destructive power was very strong. He still insisted that Jiang Pengji had won with the help of the enemy's stupid teammates. Little did he know that Lu Zheng was holding onto Wei Ci's script in this life. Wei Ci could pat his chest and guarantee that in his previous life, Her Majesty had won against Nansheng without doing anything. In his previous life, An Shui had insisted on using all his troops to wipe out the 4 factions of Nanman. He had won, but his strength had been greatly damaged. In the end, Her Majesty, his neighbor, had picked up the spoils. Wherever the army passed, there was almost no decent resistance. They were like a hot knife through butter, and they had forced An Shui to his death. Recently, Wei Ci had rarely thought about his previous life. Now that he looked back, he realized that his old master An Shui had not lived as well as he had in his previous life. In his previous life, he had at least committed suicide with dignity. In this life, he had been forced to the altar and killed by his lord. After placing the chess piece, Jiang Pengji asked LV Zheng, "Did Hua Yuan do anything disgusting?" Although it was a personality created by Hua Yuan, this personality called himself Lu Shi. Whenever she thought of what disgusting things he had done with this identity, Jiang Pengji felt uneasy. It did not cause her any substantial harm, but it was disgusting. As soon as she asked, she remembered something. She had previously received information that one of the siblings from the Xichang royal family whom she had chased away had been kept by An Shui, and the other had been given to Hua Yuan as a reward. In an instant, Jiang Pengji's face turned green. She wanted to kill Hua Yuan with her own hands, and no one could stop her. Unexpectedly, just as Jiang Pengji had made up her mind to kill Hua Yuan had disappeared. She was not mistaken, he had disappeared. At first, no one paid much attention to it, but when the old housekeeper realized that his master had not returned for 2 consecutive days, he sent someone to the magistrate's office to inquire. Only after asking did he find out that they had not seen Hua Yuan for a day or 2. The servant's heart thumped, and he hurriedly passed the news to the old housekeeper. All the servants and maids in the manor were sent out to search. They inquired along the way, and after a thorough search, they finally found some clues. Some people who had witnessed it said that someone who looked like Hua Yuan had staggered out of the north of the city. They searched along the way, but they soon lost track of him. Only then did everyone realize a serious problem. Hua Yuan did not seem to be pretending to be crazy. He was really crazy. What should we do now? Not only were the servants and maids in Hua Yuan's manor panicking, but Hua Yuan's former colleagues were also panicking. Those old foxes who had been fighting openly and covertly even stopped fighting. They knew how much the late Lord, An Shui, valued Hua Yuan. The latter held considerable military power. If they wanted to gather their troops and work together to resist the invading Jiang Pengji, Hua Yuan could not be lost. Now that Hua Yuan had gone completely crazy, what could they do if he left them behind? What else can we do? Search. I don't believe that we can't find him even if we dig 3 feet into the ground. Heaven always failed those who tried. After half a month, they still could not find Hua Yuan's whereabouts. Instead, they found a lot of specious clues. They sent people to search, but they found nothing every time. They went around in circles, almost turning the ground upside down, but they did not even see Hua Yuan's shadow. To be honest, if not for the fact that Hua Yuan had really gone crazy, they would have suspected that this was another trap set by Hua Yuan. With so many internal troubles and endless external troubles, they could only temporarily put aside the matter of Hua Yuan's disappearance and focus on fighting the enemy. However, Jiang Pengji did not care whether they were ready to fight or not. She fought wherever she went, and she did not stop along the way. She was like a hot knife through butter. The old officials in An Shui's camp were not blind. In fact, they were better at protecting themselves than anyone else. Seeing that the situation was hopeless and that Jiang Pengji was destined to win, they planned to lead their troops and surrender before Jiang Pengji used force to break open the city gates. Was surrendering something shameful? Of course not. This was called obeying fate. Autumn had just arrived that year, and the city gates of An Shui's old nest were open to welcome the new lord. To show their sincerity, they presented Jiang Pengji with a gift that had a special meaning. Looking at the Xichang princess's pregnant belly, which was about to give birth, Jiang Pengji's expression changed. Using a pregnant woman and a posthumous child of the late lord to ask for credit from the new lord was really a cunning move. Chapter 1695. Who is this? The Xichang emperor's concubine was already very pregnant. Her stomach was so heavy that she needed to support it with both hands to feel better. Jiang Pengji pretended not to recognize her, but the salted fish in the streaming room really could not. Jianguang Shengji Ji, this lady looks familiar, but I can't remember where I've seen her before. Does anyone remember her? Candy Factory, she looks familiar too. Although she's very swollen during pregnancy, her facial features are quite beautiful. Her actual appearance should be pretty good, right? The number of pretty girls in the streaming room can be counted on one hand. With such good looks, she shouldn't be unknown. The power of 5 million salted fishes was not to be underestimated. There were always a few salted fishes with better memories. Host marry me, wait, I remember now. No wonder she looks familiar. She seems to be the Xichang Emperor's concubine. Someone recalled it and gave a hint, but most of the salted fish were still in a state of confusion. Who was the Xichang Emperor's concubine? Was she famous? However, just by hearing the title, Emperor's Concubine, one could tell that she came from a noble background and had an extraordinary status. After following the map, everyone finally matched the Xichang Emperor's concubine with some memories that were thrown in a corner. Many people suddenly realized that it was her. 200 kilograms salted fish, the Xichang Emperor's concubine? I have some impression of this woman. How did she become like this? Back then, there was a salted fish who participated in Dream of 1,000 Years, and became the guard that escorted the Xichang Emperor's concubine and the Xichang prince. The salted fish in the streaming room also saw the fairy-like siblings through the perspective of Dream of 1,000 Years. They both had faces that made people want to fall in love at first sight. It had only been a year since they last saw each other. How did the Xichang Emperor's concubine become like this? Actually, it was not difficult to guess. The Xichang Emperor's concubine was now An Shui's concubine. She was pregnant with An Shui's posthumous child. She was considered a rather special prisoner of war. Jiang Pengji did not intend to make things difficult for her, but she could not stop a few of An Shui's former officials from taking a shortcut. They took the initiative to present the Xichang Emperor's concubine to take credit and flatter her. Pregnancy was a very difficult matter. Xichang's Empress concubine's pregnancy was not very stable. In addition, she was constantly worried that her child's bloodline would be exposed, so her pregnancy was even more difficult. So many changes had happened in the past few months that she was on tenterhooks even in her dreams. As a result, she looked haggard and old. Her face was swollen several times, and the fat piled up on her double chin. Her thick neck made her collarbone disappear, and her red phoenix eyes were squinted. Where was the fairy-like face that made people fall in love at first sight? If it weren't for the fact that his facial features still had traces of being at the peak of his attractiveness, even if 5 million salted fish gathered together, they wouldn't be able to guess who he was. Without batting an eyelid, Jiang Pengji took the initiative to present the surrendered officials of the Xichang Emperor concubine as an explanation. This person was originally a concubine of the Xichang royal family. She was later taken in as a concubine by the late Lord An Shui. The child in her womb is the late lord's posthumous child. Hearing the surrendered official say this, the expressionless Xichang Emperor concubine finally reacted. She covered her face with her empty hand as though she could not bear it. Jiang Pengji looked away. An Shui's posthumous son? I thought that you would care about the relationship between the ruler and the subject and preserve the last of his bloodline. The expressions of the surrendered officials suddenly changed, as if they had been painted with a thick layer of white paint. They'd only heard that Jiang Pengji was difficult to deal with, but they didn't expect her to be so harsh with her words. She didn't leave them any face at all. What she'd said just now was just short of pointing at their noses and scolding them as heartless and unscrupulous villains. For a moment, their faces were a little hot, as if they'd been slapped a few times in the face in front of the world. However, the older, the wiser. They were all people who were used to great storms and waves. Their mental fortitude was rather strong, and they wouldn't change their expressions because of this. Not only would they not change their expressions, but they would also find a suitable excuse to save some face for themselves in the shortest time possible. Why had they offered An Shui's concubine and posthumous son? It was all for their new lord, Jiang Pengji. Since Jiang Pengji was the person destined by the heavens, even if An Shui was their former lord, they had to look up to a wise lord. Whoever the heavens had chosen to be the true dragon emperor, they should follow the will of the heavens to assist that person. How could they do something that went against the will of the heavens because of a wrong relationship between the ruler and the subject? Moreover, since Jiangpengji was the true dragon emperor, she had a heart that could accept all rivers running into the sea. How could she be so petty that she couldn't even accept the posthumous son of a defeated opponent? They offered Shui's concubine and posthumous son, naturally, not to take credit and curry favor. Regardless of whether she could accept them or not, they'd said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done. They'd fulfilled their duties as subjects. The rest was Jiangpengji's business. They were indeed old fellows who had lived a long life. They had a sense of propriety. If it had been someone else who had the bad habit of being overzealous, these words would have had a huge effect. Which person in a high position wouldn't like to listen to flattery? However, the person they were facing now was none other than Jiangpengji. Jiangpengji ignored the flattery of these old fellows and turned to ask about the age of the fetus in Xichang's princess's womb. The princess's voice was very embarrassed. She wished she could dig a hole and bury herself in it. She didn't know how she'd gotten to this point. The first time she saw Jiangpengji, she was still the princess of a country and received courteous treatment. Now, however, she was the concubine of a defeated opponent. Naturally, she was a captive and an existence at the mercy of others. Jiangpengji silently calculated the time in her heart. The other party was about to give birth soon. You are Shui's concubine, and you're pregnant with his posthumous son. I've never liked to make things difficult for the old, weak, women, and children. Shui's bloodline is only left with this one in your womb. Then you can rest assured and give birth to this child. I'll send people to take care of you and your son. She didn't have any emotional fluctuations, as if the princess was an unimportant passerby. In reality, she was indeed a passerby, not worthy of her attention. The princess had thought she was dead for sure. She'd never expected this outcome. If she could live, could the child in her womb also live? For a moment, the princess's heart was filled with mixed feelings. Thousands of thoughts tangled in her heart. These days, she'd racked her brains for survival. She'd been anxious and uneasy for so long. To her, matters of life and death were not worth mentioning in Jiangpengji's eyes. With a few simple words, she'd decided whether she lived or died. She'd decided the future of the child in her womb. The jealousy in the princess's heart churned endlessly. The sour taste almost surged up her throat. Was this what it felt like to hold great power? A single word determined life. A single word threatened death. It wasn't until now that the princess understood what it meant to say, thunder, rain, and dew are all the king's grace. Jiangpengji didn't care about the princess's matter. She was more concerned about Hua Yuan's whereabouts. That lunatic dared to imagine that he was Lushi? You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.